My name is Riley, 30 years old, and I am about to show my family exactly who they have been messing with. On my 30th birthday, my 16-year-old nephew looked me dead in the eye, hurled a bright red strawberry cocktail directly onto my white silk dress, and laughed. "Now you look as cheap as you really are," he sneered. My mother took his side. I just smiled. That night, I canceled my sister's credit card. At 8 the next morning, her son woke up to find his car gone. And then the real games began. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The air inside the Prime Cut Steakhouse in downtown Chicago was thick with the scent of seared wagyu and expensive cologne. It was supposed to be a joyous celebration for my 30th birthday, but sitting at that corner table felt like sitting in a courtroom awaiting sentencing. The crystal chandeliers overhead cast a warm golden glow over the crisp white tablecloths, but the energy radiating from my family was absolutely freezing. I kept my hands folded neatly in my lap, desperately trying to maintain an expression of polite gratitude. My mother, Cynthia, had spent the entire appetizer course critiquing my hair, my posture, and my seemingly unimpressive career. She adjusted her pearls and sighed heavily as she looked at my simple jewelry. "You really should invest in some quality pieces, Riley," my mother said, her voice carrying that familiar tone of disappointment. "A woman of your age working a dead-end accounting job needs all the help she can get to find a decent husband." Beside her sat my older sister Brittany, dripping in designer diamonds and scrolling through her phone with absolute boredom. Brittany had always been the golden child, the one who married well and provided the perfect grandson. Next to Brittany was Jamal, my African-American brother-in-law, projecting the flawless image of a wildly successful tech founder in his bespoke tailored suit. Jamal loved to play the part of the wealthy patriarch, constantly checking his expensive watch and complaining about the slow service. He boasted loudly about his recent business acquisitions, making sure the neighboring tables could hear every inflated dollar amount. I simply nodded, taking a sip of my water, knowing fully well that his tech startup was drowning in toxic debt and on the verge of total collapse. And then there was Braden, their 16-year-old son, slouched in his chair and glaring at the waiter with a level of entitlement that only comes from being spoiled rotten. He wore a designer jacket that cost more than my supposed monthly rent, and he had spent the last hour making snide remarks about my modest car and my lack of social status. I took a deep breath, trying to focus on the positive aspects of the evening. I was wearing a beautiful white silk dress I had bought specifically for this occasion. It was elegant, understated, and made me feel genuinely confident. For once, I wanted to feel like I belonged at the table, without drawing too much attention. My family firmly believed I was just a low-level corporate drone scraping by in a tiny city apartment. They had absolutely no idea I was the undercover founder of a massive venture capital firm specializing in distressed assets and hostile takeovers. I had spent years buying up their debt, secretly funding their lavish lifestyle to protect their fragile egos. I played the part of the poor sister perfectly because the truth would have shattered their entire delusional world. The waiter arrived to pour more sparkling water, and Jamal loudly scoffed. "Make sure you bring the vintage reserve Cabernet," Jamal ordered, waving his hand dismissively at the young man. "Put it on the birthday girl tab. She needs to learn how to treat her betters." Brittany giggled behind her manicured hand and leaned into Jamal. "Be nice, babe," Brittany whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. "You know accountants do not make that much money. We might bankrupt her tonight." They all chuckled a shared cruel joke at my expense while my mother nodded in agreement. I remained silent, refusing to let them see how their words stung. I had built a fortress around my emotions long ago. But Braden was not satisfied with just words. He craved the spotlight and he wanted a bigger reaction. He wanted to completely break me in public. Braden had been swirling a tall glass filled with a bright red strawberry cocktail, the ice clinking loudly and obnoxiously against the rim. He lifted the glass to his lips, but did not drink. Instead, he locked his cold, arrogant eyes with mine across the table. The restaurant ambient noise seemed to fade away into a dull hum. I saw his grip tighten around the crystal glass. There was no sudden stumble. There was no accidental bump from a passing waiter. There was no slip of the hand whatsoever. With a deliberate, calculated, and vicious flick of his wrist, Braden hurled the entire contents of his heavy glass directly at my chest. The icy, sticky red liquid splashed violently against the pristine white silk, soaking instantly through the delicate fabric. The vibrant red stain bloomed across my dress like a gaping wound, ruining the garment entirely, and dripping down onto my lap. I gasped from the sudden shock of the cold ice hitting my skin. Gasps echoed from the adjacent tables as horrified diners turned to witness the spectacle. But at our table there was only a chilling lack of surprise. Braden slammed the empty glass down onto the white tablecloth and leaned back in his chair, a vicious, satisfied smirk twisting his lips. "Now you look as cheap as you really are." He sneered, his voice intentionally loud enough for the neighboring diners to hear clearly. The absolute cruelty of his words hung heavily in the air, sealing my breaking point. I knew right then that I was going to utterly destroy the false reality they had comfortably lived in for so many years. The echo of Braden's cruel words hung heavily in the air, vibrating over the soft jazz and clinking silverware of the prime-cut steakhouse. The bright red strawberry cocktail dripped slowly from my collarbone, the icy, sticky liquid soaking deeper and deeper into the delicate white silk of my dress. I sat perfectly still. The ambient noise of the crowded Chicago restaurant seemed to instantly mute itself, reducing the hum of privileged conversation and bustling waiters to a distant ringing static in my ears. I felt the cold syrup sliding down my chest, a physical manifestation of the utter disrespect radiating from the people sitting across from me. I turned my eyes slowly, dragging my gaze away from Braden's triumphant, arrogant teenage sneer. I looked directly at my father, Howard. He was a man obsessed with appearances, a man who built his entire personality around projecting upper-class dignity and demanding respect from everyone around him. Surely a physical assault at a Michelin-starred restaurant would breach his strict code of decorum. I waited for his booming voice to reprimand the boy, but Howard simply cleared his throat, picked up his crystal water glass and looked deliberately toward the ornate ceiling architecture, entirely washing his hands of the situation. He chose the path of least resistance, abandoning me just as he always had. Next, I looked at Cynthia, my mother, the woman who was supposed to be my ultimate protector. I waited for the maternal instinct to finally kick in, for the shock to register on her perfectly maintained face, for her to snatch the glass from her spoiled grandson and demand an apology. Instead, Cynthia calmly reached out with her manicured hand, her expression completely devoid of warmth or empathy. She picked up a small, crisp cocktail napkin from the center of the table and held it out toward me. Her eyes were hard, flat, and intensely irritated. She leaned in, her voice a low, venomous hiss meant only for our table. "You should not have worn white if you did not know how to conduct yourself in a fine dining establishment, Riley." The sheer audacity of her words felt like a second splash of ice water, colder and far more damaging than the first. She was looking at my ruined dress not as a victim of her grandson's vicious cruelty, but as a testament to my own inherent clumsiness and lack of class. "If you insist on causing a scene, do try to clean yourself up before you embarrass us further," she muttered, dropping the paper napkin onto the table right next to my plate. A low, synchronized chuckle broke the suffocating tension, but it was not a sound of discomfort. It was pure, unadulterated amusement. Brittany, my flawless older sister, was casually wiping a tear of mirth from the corner of her eye, careful not to smudge her designer makeup. She nudged Jamal with her elbow, clearly thoroughly entertained by my public humiliation. Jamal leaned back in his chair, adjusting the cuffs of his custom suit, a wide, predatory grin showcasing his perfectly veneered teeth. He did not even look at me. His attention was already back on the restaurant's staff, completely dismissing my presence. "Waiter," Jamal called out, snapping his fingers in the air with the kind of arrogant entitlement he had perfected over the years. Bring us the reserve wine menu. We need to wash down this little performance with the most expensive Cabernet you have in the cellar. He finally glanced sideways at me, his eyes gleaming with a sick, greedy malice, and put it on the birthday girl's tab. We are celebrating her big 3-0 after all. It was in that exact second, watching Jamal order $1,000 bottle of wine on my dime, while I sat drenched in sticky red syrup, that the final frayed thread of my familial devotion snapped. For 30 years I had played the role they assigned me. I had been the quiet, unassuming, low-level accountant. I had tolerated the endless jabs, the vicious exclusion, and the blatant financial parasitism because I believed foolishly that blood meant loyalty. I had secretly bought up their toxic debts, sustained their lavish lifestyles through anonymous holding companies, and protected them from their own catastrophic financial incompetence, all in the desperate hope that one day I would earn my seat at their table. I had hidden my true wealth and my ruthless corporate identity simply to keep the peace. But sitting there shivering in my ruined silk dress, surrounded by their deafening silence and cruel amusement, my heart permanently stopped bleeding for them. The hurt, the longing for parental validation, the desperate need for sisterly affection, it all evaporated in a single heartbeat. It was replaced by a sensation of absolute terrifying zero. A glacial calm washed over my mind, sharpening my focus to a razor's edge. The emotional vault slammed shut, locking away the dutiful daughter forever. The woman sitting in that chair was no longer the pathetic, desperate relative they thought they knew. The undercover founder of a ruthless venture capital firm woke up calculating, cold, and ready to execute. I looked at the 5 people sitting around me and saw them not as family, but as liabilities. Distressed assets, toxic debt that needed to be aggressively and permanently liquidated. I picked up the small paper napkin Cynthia had discarded. Moving with deliberate, unhurried grace, I dabbed the sticky red syrup from my cheek and collarbone. I did not scrub. I did not try to frantically salvage the dress. I simply removed the physical discomfort from my skin, my movements slow and precise. Then I looked up. I looked at Braden, whose arrogant smirk faltered slightly under the sudden heavy weight of my gaze. I looked at Brittany and Jamal, whose laughter slowly died in their throats as they noticed the absolute void in my expression. Finally, I looked at Howard and Cynthia. I did not scream. I did not demand an apology. I did not throw a glass back. I simply smiled. It was a chilling, silent, dead-eyed smile that reached deep into the core of the room, a smile that conveyed absolutely nothing but a promise they were too blind to understand. I reached for my clutch. I unclasped the subtle hardware, bypassed the heavy black cards that secretly ran their entire fraudulent lives, and pulled out a crisp $100 bill. I placed it gently on top of the ruined cocktail napkin in the center of the table. This covers my steak and my sparkling water. I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion, echoing with a terrifying finality that made Jamal shift uncomfortably in his seat. I stood up my chair, sliding back silently on the thick luxury carpet. I smoothed the skirt of my stained dress, standing taller and more powerful than I ever had in their presence. Without another word, without a single backward glance to acknowledge their existence, I turned and walked away. I could feel the eyes of the entire restaurant on my back, but I held my head high, my posture immaculate. The maitre d' stepped aside quickly, holding the heavy glass doors open as I exited the prime-cut steakhouse and stepped out into the cool, unforgiving Chicago night. I stepped off the bustling Chicago sidewalk and slid into the driver's seat of my custom sedan. The heavy reinforced door slammed shut instantly, severing the ambient noise of the city traffic and the distant chatter of oblivious pedestrians. The thick, acoustic glass transformed the chaotic urban environment into a muted, distant movie playing out beyond my windshield. I sat in the absolute darkness of the cabin for a long, unbroken moment, gripping the hand-stitched leather steering wheel. My breathing was incredibly slow, perfectly measured, and strictly controlled. There were absolutely no tears prickling my eyes. There was no trembling in my hands. The pathetic, submissive daughter they had just mocked inside that steakhouse was entirely gone, shed like a worthless, cheap costume. The real Riley, the apex predator of LaSalle Street, stretched her legs and took the wheel. The quiet sanctuary of my car was my command center. It was a fortress of solitude where my corporate identity breathed freely away from the suffocating toxic expectations of my parents and siblings. I reached toward the center console and placed my thumb against the biometric scanner hidden beneath the armrest. The dashboard interface immediately transformed from a standard generic radio display into a highly encrypted, multi-layered financial terminal. My unassuming vehicle was outfitted with military-grade security protocols, directly linked to the private servers of my venture capital firm. I did not need to wait until Monday morning to dismantle their pathetic lives. I owned the board, and I controlled the bank. I tapped the secure communication icon, routing a direct line through 3 offshore relays to ensure absolute privacy before the call connected to my senior wealth manager. David answered on the first ring, his voice crisp, alert, and devoid of sleep despite the late hour. "Good evening, Ms. Riley," he said, his tone entirely professional. "The connection is secure and encrypted. Go ahead." His absolute efficiency was exactly why I paid him a 7-figure retainer every single year. He never asked questions and he never hesitated. "David, we are initiating a total asset purge on the primary family portfolio." I instructed, my voice entirely cold and clinical. There was no emotion in my delivery, just pure lethal business execution. "I want to execute the immediate severing clauses on all familial sub-accounts." David's keyboard clacked rapidly and rhythmically through the secure channel. "I am accessing the master ledger now, Ms. Riley," he responded smoothly. "Awaiting your specific targets." "Let us start with Brittany," I commanded, pulling up her sprawling, fraudulent financial web on my glowing dashboard screen. "She currently carries the Centurion Black Card issued under the Orion Holdings umbrella. That card is her entire identity. It funds her designer wardrobe, her daily spa treatments, and the illusion of superiority she breathes like oxygen. Flag the account as critically compromised and permanently terminate the line of credit immediately. Do not issue a replacement card under any circumstances. Furthermore, I want you to decline any pending authorizations from the last 24 hours. If she tries to buy a single cup of coffee tomorrow morning, I want the terminal to flash a hard, humiliating decline." "Consider it done," David confirmed, his voice unwavering as he executed the commands. "The Centurion account is officially dead. The credit limit has been reduced to 0. Now for Jamal." I continued, my eyes narrowing at the financial data scrolling across my screen. "He thinks he is a visionary tech founder. He loves to play the part of the wealthy patriarch while treating me like a peasant. Let us show him what actual ruthless capital looks like. Liquidate the shadow credit line we set up through the Delaware LLC. Yes, the exact one, artificially inflating his failing startup valuation and paying his exorbitant executive salary." David paused for a fraction of a second, reviewing the legal parameters of the account. "Ms. Riley triggering that specific covenant clause will immediately drain the liquidity pool from his corporate accounts," he cautioned professionally. "Calling in that mezzanine debt tonight will essentially render his entire company legally insolvent by sunrise. The primary lenders will detect the massive capital flight and freeze his operational accounts instantly. His payroll will bounce. His vendor checks will fail. Are you explicitly authorizing a total structural corporate collapse?" I stared out the windshield at a flickering amber street lamp, listening to the steady hum of my car engine. I pictured Jamal sitting in the restaurant laughing as he ordered a $1,000 bottle of wine on my tab, while my ruined dress clung to my skin. I remembered the condescending smirk on his face when he told me to relax and accept the disrespect. "I am authorizing a total and absolute structural collapse." "David," I stated, my voice resonating with terrifying finality. "Drain the liquidity pool completely. Call in every single cent of the shadow debt. Burn his fraudulent empire to the absolute ground." The sound of David pressing the enter key echoed sharply through the car speakers, sealing their fate. "Commands executed sequentially, Ms. Riley," David reported. "The corporate capital has been successfully recalled to your primary offshore holding account. The black card is terminated. The financial safety nets have been permanently removed. They are officially exposed and entirely completely bankrupt. Excellent work, David, I replied softly, feeling a profound, absolute peace settling over my chest. Keep your phone on loud tomorrow. I anticipate they will be making quite a bit of noise once the sun comes up. Good night. I severed the connection and the digital terminal went dark, returning to its standard unassuming display. I sat alone in the quiet sanctuary of my car, the faint glow of the dashboard illuminating my calm, unbothered face. The first invisible domino had just been pushed, setting off a catastrophic chain reaction that could never be undone. The structural integrity of their entire fabricated reality had been fatally compromised. Right now, they were sitting in a luxury steakhouse, sipping expensive reserve wine, and basking in their perceived dominance, completely oblivious to the financial guillotine that was currently slicing down toward their necks. I shifted the car into drive and pulled away from the curb, smoothly merging into the midnight downtown traffic, leaving the restaurant and the illusion of the helpless sister far behind in the rearview mirror. Sunlight filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my downtown penthouse signaled the arrival of 8 o'clock in the morning. I stood in my sleek, minimalist kitchen, a steaming mug of black coffee in my hand, watching the sprawling city wake up far below. I wore a plush robe entirely undisturbed by the dramatic events of the previous night. My mind was sharp-rested and completely untethered from the emotional baggage I had carried for 3 decades. The silence of my kitchen was profound, a sharp, beautiful contrast to the chaotic noise I knew was currently erupting in the suburbs. Right on schedule, my personal cell phone began to vibrate violently against the cool marble countertop. The screen flashed brightly, displaying an incoming call from Brittany. I let it ring. It stopped, then immediately started vibrating again, a relentless, frantic assault on my device. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, savoring the rich, dark roast, before finally reaching out and tapping the green accept button. I did not even get the chance to say hello. A shrill, hysterical shriek tore through the speaker, forcing me to hold the phone several inches away from my ear. Riley Brittany screamed, her voice completely devoid of its usual arrogant melodic tone. She sounded feral, breathless, and utterly unhinged. "Are you happy now? Is this what you wanted? You petty, vindictive little monster?" I leaned comfortably against the counter, tracing the rim of my mug with my index finger. "Good morning to you too, Brittany," I replied, my voice a flat, unyielding plateau. I listened closely as she gasped for air. In the background of the call, I could hear a loud crashing sound followed by the unmistakable noise of Braden throwing a violent tantrum. He was yelling profanities, kicking something heavy and expensive, likely one of the imported decorative urns lining their grand foyer. "My car." Brittany wailed, the panic morphing into a ragged, ugly sob. "Braden's car. It is gone, Riley. It is completely gone. Someone took it right out of the driveway." She was hyperventilating now, stumbling over her words as she tried to frantically explain the impossible situation. The brand new Porsche Macan. The six-figure 16th birthday present they had paraded around the exclusive country club just 3 weeks ago. The ultimate status symbol they had purchased solely to prove their superiority to the entire gated community. Brittany babbled incoherently about waking up, walking downstairs to get her morning matcha, and casually glancing out the bay window. The pristine, custom-paved driveway was entirely empty. There was no shattered glass on the concrete. There were no screeching tire marks left behind. The heavy luxury vehicle had simply vanished into thin air while they slept soundly in their custom silk sheets. "I know you did this!" Brittany spat, her tone shifting rapidly from bewildered despair to venomous accusation. "I know exactly what kind of sick, jealous game you are playing right now. You were embarrassed last night. You could not handle a simple joke at dinner, so you decided to retaliate like a total psychopath. You called the police, did not you? You called some shady tow truck company to haul it away out of pure spite just because of a stupid dress. You probably lied and told them it was parked illegally or blocking a fire hydrant. You are actively trying to humiliate us in front of the neighbors." I took another leisurely sip of my coffee, looking out over the glittering skyline. The sheer lack of self-awareness radiating through the phone was staggering. Brittany honestly believed my response to a calculated physical assault at a luxury restaurant was to call a random local tow company for a petty neighborhood prank. She thought my wrath was as small and inconsequential as the miserable life she assumed I lived. She had absolutely no concept of the colossal financial machinery I had just unleashed upon her household. She was looking at a missing car and thinking it was a childish prank, completely oblivious to the fact that her entire economic foundation had already been vaporized by my command. I listened to her rave, letting the heavy silence stretch on my end of the line. Braden was screaming louder now, his voice cracking as he demanded that his father fix the situation immediately. He was demanding that Jamal call the mayor, the police chief, the governor. He wanted his luxury toy back. He wanted his precious status symbol returned right this second. The arrogant boy who had sneered at me and ruined my clothing just 12 hours prior was currently sobbing like a toddler whose favorite pacifier had been snatched away. Brittany demanded I confess to the crime. She threatened to call the police on me directly. She threatened to sue me for grand theft auto and emotional distress. She hurled every legal buzzword she could remember from watching television dramas, demanding I return the vehicle before she ruined my miserable little accounting career. I let her exhaust her vocabulary. I let her scream until her throat grew hoarse and ragged. The sheer panic in her tone was intoxicating, a stark, brilliant contrast to the smug, untouchable superiority she had worn like a crown the night before. She demanded an explanation, a full confession, and a groveling apology. She demanded that I fix the nightmare she believed I had orchestrated through cheap, petty means. I remained entirely silent, absorbing the chaotic, beautiful symphony of their collapsing world. I let her frantic breathing fill the silence. She demanded a confession. She demanded an emotional, screaming fight where she could play the victim and brand me the crazy, jealous sibling. I refused to grant her that satisfaction. There would be no argument. There would be no desperate back and forth or theatrical apologies. Instead of matching her hysterical energy, I pulled the phone away from my ear and tapped the screen, opening my encrypted mail client. I navigated to a specific folder, bypassing the massive holding company ledgers, and located a single meticulously drafted file prepared by my legal team just 48 hours prior. It was a standard, utterly unremarkable PDF document bearing the stark, intimidating letterhead of Cobalt Financial Holdings. I attached the file to a blank email typed in Brittany's personal address and hit send. The small, satisfying swoosh sound from my phone confirmed the delivery. I brought the device back to my ear. Brittany was still raving, her voice hoarse from shouting threats about hiring the most ruthless lawyers in Chicago to sue me into oblivion. "Check your inbox," I said. My voice was a flat, unyielding plateau devoid of any sisterly affection or fear. What Brittany snapped the sudden interruption, completely derailing her train of thought. "What are you talking about, Riley? I am talking about the police. I am talking about Grand Theft Auto. Do not try to change the subject." "Open your email, Brittany," I repeated, speaking slowly and clearly, as if instructing a particularly slow child. "Open it right now." I heard a sharp intake of breath, followed by the muffled sound of the phone being pulled away from her face. A moment later, a distinct chime echoed through the receiver, signaling a new message hitting her inbox. The heavy silence that followed was beautiful. I could visualize her perfectly manicured finger tapping the screen, her tear-stained eyes squinting at the harsh glare of the PDF document illuminating her face. I listened to the rustling of fabric as she likely sank onto her expensive Italian leather sofa, the fight rapidly draining from her body as her eyes scanned the bold, capitalized legal text. "What is this?" she finally whispered. Her voice was no longer a furious scream. It was small, fragile, and laced with genuine confusion. "This says it is a notice of default and repossession." "What is Cobalt Financial Holdings? Why are they sending me a notice about Braden's car?" "Read the second paragraph," I instructed, taking a slow sip of my coffee. Read the name of the primary leaseholder. I heard her sharp, ragged inhale. "Riley Anderson. She read aloud, the syllables stumbling over her tongue as her brain struggled to process the impossible information. Managing Director, Cobalt Financial Holdings. This makes no sense. We bought this car at the dealership. Jamal handled the financing. We pay the lease. You do not pay the lease, I corrected her, my tone absolutely clinical. That is the entire problem, Brittany. Jamal secured the vehicle through a specialized subprime exotic auto broker because his personal credit is completely destroyed. That broker is a subsidiary of Cobalt Financial Holdings. My company. I own the paper on that Porsche. I am the actual legal leaseholder. You and Jamal are merely the delinquent sublessees. That is impossible, she stammered, the denial thick and desperate. Jamal makes millions. We have money, Riley. We are rich. You have the illusion of money, I countered, slicing through her delusion with cold, hard facts. You live in a house of cards financed by toxic debt. The document you are looking at is not a prank. It is a formalized legal reality. If you look at Section 4, you will clearly see the payment ledger. You and Jamal have missed 3 consecutive monthly payments on that vehicle. 90 days delinquent. Under the strict terms of the lease agreement, which Jamal blindly signed without having his imaginary legal team review the vehicle, is subject to immediate unannounced repossession. Braden's muffled shouting in the background suddenly stopped, likely because he was straining to hear the conversation. I took a deep breath, relishing the absolute power shift. I did not call a local tow truck out of spite for a ruined dress, Brittany. I do not operate on that petty level. What happened this morning was a standard, highly regulated corporate asset recovery operation. At exactly 0400 hours, a flatbed truck, equipped with stealth hydraulic lifts, coasted into your pristine gated neighborhood. My asset recovery specialists did not knock on your mahogany front door. They did not announce themselves to the neighborhood watch. They simply verified the VIN on the dashboard, bypassed the McCann's electronic security grid, lifted the vehicle onto the flatbed, and secured it in under 4 minutes. It was a surgical, perfectly legal extraction of corporate property. The car was never yours. No, Brittany gasped, a desperate, pathetic whimper. No, Riley, please, you cannot do this. Braden loves that car. He drove it to school every day. All his friends know it is his. You cannot just take it away. He will be a laughingstock. He drove a vehicle you could not afford, I stated, entirely unmoved by her sudden shift to begging. He paraded a status symbol funded by the aunt he publicly humiliated. The asset has been successfully recovered and is currently sitting in a secure, climate-controlled impound lot on the south side. By Monday morning, it will be loaded onto a transport carrier and shipped to a private auction house in Miami to liquidate the outstanding debt. The Porsche is gone, Brittany. It is never coming back. But we can pay you, she pleaded, the sound of her crying returning, but this time it was born of absolute terror, not anger. I will tell Jamal to wire the money today. We will catch up on the 3 months. We will pay the penalty fees. Just tell the tow company to bring it back. Please, Riley. I am begging you. Do not embarrass us like this. You cannot pay me, I replied, setting my coffee mug down on the marble counter with a solid thud. The default clause is irrevocable after 90 days. The contract is permanently terminated. Furthermore, you currently have absolutely zero liquidity to execute a wire transfer. What do you mean? She asked, the panic escalating to a fever pitch. Check your primary checking accounts, Brittany. Try to log into your banking portal. The Porsche was merely the first asset on the recovery schedule. Have a wonderful morning. I disconnected the call, cutting off her frantic, terrified screaming. I tossed the phone onto the counter and turned back toward the window, watching the morning sun fully illuminate the city below. The surgical strike was proceeding flawlessly. I watched the morning sun fully illuminate the city below, savoring the profound quiet of my penthouse. The surgical strike was proceeding flawlessly. Before the coffee in my mug could even turn lukewarm, a new sharp chime shattered the silence. It was not my personal phone this time. It was the encrypted tablet resting on the kitchen island. A series of bright red alerts cascaded down the high-resolution screen, flashing with rhythmic urgency. The biometric lock disengaged as I swiped my hand across the interface, bringing the financial telemetry into sharp focus. The geolocation data tagged the transaction attempts at the Oak Brook Country Club, one of the most exclusive, pretentious golf establishments in the greater Chicago area. It required a six-figure initiation fee just to walk through the mahogany front doors. Jamal was exactly where I knew he would be on a Saturday morning. He was holding court in the private dining terrace, surrounded by a group of elite angel investors and private equity scouts. He desperately needed their capital to inject life support into his failing tech startup. To secure their money, he had to project an aura of limitless, untouchable wealth. The tablet displayed the granular, embarrassing details of his current desperation. At exactly 9:14, Jamal attempted to authorize a breakfast tab totaling $4,200. He had undoubtedly ordered imported white truffles, beluga caviar omelets, and vintage champagne to impress his wealthy marks. The transaction hit the Cobalt financial servers and was instantly met with a hard system-level rejection. Error code 05. Do not honor. Account liquidated. 10 seconds later, a second attempt appeared on my screen. He had handed the waiter a backup platinum card. Declined. A third attempt materialized, this time utilizing a corporate expense card tied directly to his startup. Declined. My personal cell phone lit up. The caller ID flashed Jamal's name. I swiped to answer, bringing the device to my ear with a serene, unbothered smile. "Riley, what the hell did you do?" Jamal hissed. His voice was a frantic, hushed whisper, the sound of a man hiding in a men's room or a supply closet, absolutely terrified of being overheard by his affluent guests. "Good morning, Jamal," I replied, keeping my tone exceptionally bright and pleasant. "How is the caviar at Oak Brook today?" "Listen to me, you vindictive little spreadsheet pusher," he growled, the panic evident beneath his fake bravado. "I am sitting at a table with 3 managing partners from a Tier 1 investment group. I just handed the general manager my primary corporate card to cover the breakfast spread, and the idiot brought it back saying it was declined. Then he declined my backup. Then he declined my business line. I know you manage the back-end bookkeeping for Howard. I know you have access to the routing numbers. You need to fix this banking glitch right now." He did not wait for a response, barreling forward with his delusional leverage. "You were embarrassed last night. Fine. Brayden is an idiot, and your cheap dress got ruined. But you do not mess with my business, Riley. You do not play your petty little office games with my capital. If you do not call the bank, override this security freeze, and authorize my cards in the next 60 seconds, I am calling Howard. I will have him cut you out of the family trust fund so fast your head will spin. You will never see a single dime of the inheritance. You will be stuck in a low-level accounting cubicle for the rest of your pathetic life." I let him finish his desperate, breathless threat. I let the heavy silence hang over the digital connection, allowing him to marinate in his own rising terror. I listened to the faint sound of a golf cart zooming past, wherever he was hiding. "Jamal," I began, my voice dropping an octave, replacing the pleasantry with absolute sub-zero authority. "There is no banking glitch. There is no security freeze. And most importantly, there is absolutely no family trust fund." "What are you talking about?" he stammered, the aggression faltering. "I am talking about the brutal reality of your existence," I stated clearly, my words striking like physical blows. "Howard drained the imaginary family trust a decade ago to cover his horrific real estate margins. He has been financially insolvent since before you married my sister. Your entire lifestyle, your bespoke suits, your country club memberships, and the initial seed capital for your tech startup was entirely funded by a shadow credit line, a line of credit issued by a Delaware holding company, a company that I own lock, stock, and barrel. I am the bank, Jamal. I am the sole underwriter of your fraudulent life. You are lying," he gasped, his breathing turning shallow. "You are a low-level accountant. You live in a shoebox apartment. I live exactly how I choose to live to avoid parasitic leeches like you," I countered smoothly. "Last night you told the waiter to put $1,000 bottle of wine on my tab because you thought I was poor. This morning I recalled the mezzanine debt on your startup. I drained your liquidity pool. I froze your operational accounts. Your company is currently holding zero assets. He made a choking sound, a pathetic noise of a man drowning in dry air. Those investors sitting at your table are not going to save you, Jamal. I continued, tightening the proverbial noose. In fact, my firm just sent a mass encrypted email to their risk management departments detailing your entirely fraudulent valuation metrics. By the time you walk out of that bathroom, their phones will be ringing. They will stand up, they will walk away from your table, and you will be left holding a $4,000 bill you cannot pay. Go back to the table, Jamal, I instructed softly, relishing the total devastation. Look those men in the eye as they realize you are a complete fraud. Then I suggest you ask the club manager for an apron. You have a lot of dishes to wash. I ended the call, cutting the connection with a swift tap of my finger. The second domino had officially fallen. The screen of my tablet did not remain dark for long. Before I could even turn away from the kitchen island to pour a fresh cup of coffee, the device violently buzzed against the marble. Jamal was calling back. The sheer panic in his repeated attempts was a testament to his crumbling reality. I watched his name flash across the screen 3 consecutive times before I finally swiped to answer, bringing the device back to my ear. "Listen to me, you psychotic expletive," Jamal barked the moment the line connected. His voice was a frantic, breathless rasp. He was no longer trying to keep quiet in whatever country club bathroom stall he was hiding in. "You think you can scare me with some hacker parlor trick? I do not care what firewall you breached to freeze my startup account. The corporate side is a temporary glitch. I will have my lawyers sort that out by noon. But do not you dare sit there and lie to me about the family trust." Howard showed me the portfolio ledgers himself. I let out a soft, genuine laugh that echoed through the quiet space of my penthouse. It was the laugh of someone observing a mouse trapped in a maze boasting about its freedom. "Howard showed you a heavily redacted, fabricated spreadsheet printed on premium cardstock, Jamal," I replied, my voice dripping with absolute condescension. "He showed you a fantasy. The prestigious family trust you thought you married into the endless well of generational wealth you believed would permanently cushion your pathetic life ceased to exist exactly 48 months ago. 48. That is a lie," he stammered, the aggression in his voice wavering, replaced by a high-pitched note of pure terror. "Cynthia paid for our entire month in Aspen last winter directly from the trust distribution account. I saw the wire transfer." "You saw a wire transfer originate from a blind trust named Apex Holdings," I corrected him smoothly, pulling up the exact routing history on my tablet. "Apex Holdings is not controlled by Howard. It is a subsidiary I established 4 years ago when your esteemed father-in-law came crying to my apartment, begging for salvation because he had over-leveraged the entire family estate on catastrophic commercial real estate investments. The legacy trust dried up completely. Howard was facing immediate public bankruptcy. He was going to lose the country club membership, the house, the cars, everything. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. I could almost hear the gears grinding in Jamal's head as he desperately tried to process the mathematical impossibility of his existence. I stepped in. I continued my words, striking like a hammer on an anvil. "I created the blind trust to quietly fund their lives and protect the family name. I did it anonymously so their fragile, massive egos would not shatter. But that means every single luxury you have enjoyed for the past 4 years was not paid for by generational wealth. It was paid for directly out of my personal checking accounts." "No," Jamal breathed, the sound barely registering through the phone speaker. "No, we have assets. I have assets." "You have absolutely nothing," I stated, walking over to the floor-to-ceiling window and looking down at the microscopic cars navigating the city streets. "Let us review your wardrobe, Jamal. Those bespoke Italian suits you love to flaunt, the ones you bragged about at my birthday dinner last night. They were purchased with a supplementary black card Howard gave you. That card is routed to Apex Holdings. I bought those suits. Your custom golf clubs. I bought them. Your absurd inflated initiation fee for the Oak Brook Country Club, the exact place you are currently hiding and failing to buy breakfast. I paid that fee 48 months ago to keep Howard from being publicly expelled for outstanding dues." "Stop it," he pleaded, his voice breaking. I will not stop because you need to understand the absolute totality of your parasitic existence, I countered relentlessly. Remember the luxury villa in St. Bart's you and Brittany rented last Christmas? The one where you made me sleep in the cramped guest room and treated me like your personal concierge while you ordered vintage champagne. You thought Howard gifted you that trip from the trust. It was a write-off from my corporate accounts. Every drop of champagne you drank, every hour of spa treatments you booked, every square inch of the designer lifestyle you wear like a shield, it all belongs to me. You are a walking, breathing mannequin draped entirely in my charity. Jamal tried to formulate a response, but only a wet, pathetic gagging sound came through the receiver. The bravado, the toxic masculinity, the arrogant tech founder persona he used to intimidate everyone around him, it all shattered into a million irreparable pieces. He was a man standing in an ultra-exclusive country club, suddenly realizing he was wearing clothes he did not own, carrying plastic cards with zero value, and banking on a family name that was functionally bankrupt. You called me a cheap, low-level corporate drone last night, Jamal. I reminded him softly, savoring the absolute destruction of his ego. You sat at my table, ordered $1,000 bottle of wine on my dime, and laughed while your nephew humiliated me. You thought you were so far above me because you married into old money. But there is no old money. There is only me, and I have officially cut the purse strings. Riley, please. He whispered, his voice completely devoid of pride. He was actively weeping now, the realization of his total ruin finally sinking into his bones. The investors. They are waiting for me at the table. If I walk back out there, without a working credit card, they will know. The deal will die. My company will die. Just turn the card back on for 1 hour. Let me pay the tab. I will do whatever you want. I will apologize. I will make Brittany apologize. Just please do not do this to me. I am not doing anything to you, Jamal, I replied, my tone shifting back to the icy, unyielding calm of a boardroom executioner. I am simply removing my financial support from a bad investment. You are on your own. I tapped the red icon on the screen, instantly terminating the call. I did not block his number. I wanted him to try to call back. I wanted him to hear it ring endlessly as he stood paralyzed in that country club bathroom, dreading the moment he had to walk back out to the terrace and face the wealthy investors with empty pockets. I set the tablet down on the kitchen island, picked up my coffee, and took a long, deeply satisfying sip. The morning was progressing beautifully, but the true dismantling of my family had only just begun. The illusion of wealth was dead, and the harsh, unforgiving light of reality was about to burn them all. My peaceful morning contemplation was interrupted exactly 20 minutes later. The secure line on my personal cell rang, displaying the landline number of the family estate in Lake Forest. I let it ring 3 times before accepting the call, holding the phone away from my ear in anticipation. "Get out here immediately!" Howard barked through the speaker. There was no greeting. There was no inquiry into my well-being. It was a raw, unyielding command from a man who had spent his entire life expecting total obedience. "You have exactly 45 minutes to stand in front of me and explain your insubordination." The line went dead before I could utter a single syllable. I stared at the darkened screen, a slow, predatory smile spreading across my face. The panic was finally rising to the top of the hierarchy. I did not rush. I took my time finishing my coffee. I showered methodically, applied my makeup, and dressed in a sharply tailored charcoal suit that projected absolute corporate authority. I was not going to this meeting as their disappointing middle daughter. I was arriving as their sole creditor. The drive to Lake Forest took just under an hour. I navigated my sleek sedan through the winding tree-lined streets of the affluent suburb, pulling up to the massive wrought iron gates of the family compound. The estate was a sprawling, ivy-covered Tudor mansion that screamed old money and generational prestige. The perfectly manicured lawns, the imposing stone facade, and the circular driveway paved with imported cobblestones were all designed to intimidate. For years, walking through those heavy oak front doors had made me feel small and insignificant. Today, I looked at the sprawling property and saw nothing but a massive depreciating liability on my balance sheet. I parked near the fountain and walked up the front steps. Maria, the housekeeper whose salary I quietly paid every 2 weeks, opened the door with a nervous, sympathetic glance. She directed me toward the formal drawing room at the end of the main hall. I pushed open the heavy double doors and stepped inside. The atmosphere was thick, suffocating, and instantly recognizable. It was a meticulously staged tribunal. The drawing room was a dark, oppressive space filled with mahogany bookshelves, Persian rugs, and leather furniture. It was the room Howard used to terminate executives and discipline his children. My parents were positioned at the far end of the room, seated rigidly in twin, high-backed wing chairs like royalty holding court. Howard wore a crisp cashmere sweater over a collared shirt, his jaw clenched, his eyes radiating furious indignation. Cynthia sat perfectly upright beside him, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her signature pearls resting against her collarbone. Her face was a mask of aristocratic disappointment. Off to the periphery, huddled on a velvet love seat, were Brittany and Jamal. They looked completely broken. Brittany's eyes were swollen and red, her makeup smeared across her cheeks. Jamal was staring at the floor, his face pale, sweating profusely, despite the cool temperature of the room. They had clearly run straight to the patriarch the moment their respective worlds collapsed, seeking shelter behind his perceived power. I did not take a seat. I stopped in the center of the Persian rug, planting my feet shoulder-width apart, clasping my hands behind my back. I met my father's furious gaze with absolute unblinking calm. "What is the meaning of this spectacle?" Riley, my father, demanded, his voice booming off the wood-paneled walls. The sheer volume was designed to make me flinch. It failed. "I want an explanation right this second for the rogue, malicious actions you took this morning." I remained silent, allowing his anger to echo through the large room. "You have completely crossed the line," my mother interjected, her tone sharp and venomous. "We put up with your sullen attitude last night because we understand you are jealous of your sister. We tolerate your miserable antisocial behavior to keep the peace. But to wake up today and use your administrative access at the firm to freeze Jamal's business cards, to illegally tow your nephew's vehicle out of pure, unadulterated spite. You have embarrassed this family on a catastrophic level." It was staggering to witness. They truly believed this was a simple temper tantrum. They thought I had abused my low-level accounting credentials to temporarily lock their debit cards and hire a rogue tow truck. They possessed zero comprehension of the macro-level financial demolition that had just occurred. Jamal and Brittany had clearly omitted the devastating truths I had spoken to them on the phone, too terrified to admit to Howard that the money was gone. They had framed it as a technical sabotage orchestrated by a jealous sister. "I am waiting for an answer, Riley," Howard growled, leaning forward in his leather chair, gripping the armrests until his knuckles turned white. Jamal was in the middle of a crucial capital acquisition meeting. "You humiliated him in front of Tier 1 investors. You terrorized your sister and made your nephew cry. You abused company software to freeze their routing numbers. You are going to pull out your phone right now, unlock those accounts, and authorize the immediate return of that Porsche." I tilted my head slightly, observing the absolute arrogance rolling off him. "And if I decline that request, Howard?" His eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. "You do not decline a direct order in this house. If you do not fix this mess within the next 5 minutes, I will call the board of directors. I will have you stripped of your accounting credentials, terminated from your position, and completely removed from the family trust. You will be entirely cut off. I will see to it that you never work in the financial sector of this city again. You will have absolutely nothing." Cynthia nodded in fierce agreement. "You have brought this on yourself, Riley. You need to learn your place in this family. You are a subordinate, and you have severely overstepped your boundaries. Fix the accounts, apologize to your brother-in-law, and perhaps your father will show you some leniency." I looked at Jamal, who was still staring at the floor, too cowardly to meet my eyes. I looked at Brittany, who was silently weeping into a tissue. Then I looked back at the two people who had spent 3 decades making me feel like a worthless burden. They sat upon their imaginary thrones wielding the threat of financial ruin like a bloody sword, entirely oblivious to the fact that their kingdom had already burned to the ground. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the heavy, oppressive silence of the mansion stretch out until the tension in the room became almost unbearable. I unclasped my hands, reached into the inner pocket of my tailored jacket, and prepared to dismantle their entire reality. Before my fingers could grasp the encrypted flash drive resting in my breast pocket, Howard misinterpreted my calculated silence. He mistook my calm demeanor for the familiar, terrified paralysis I used to exhibit as a teenager, standing in this exact room. With a sharp, disgusted exhale, he pushed himself out of his leather wing chair. He marched over to the heavy mahogany coffee table separating us and snatched up a thick manila envelope that I had not noticed resting there. He ripped the flap open, pulled out a stack of stapled legal paper, and slammed it down onto the polished wood. With a forceful, aggressive swipe of his hand, he slid the document across the table. It came to a halt, just inches from the toes of my leather pumps. "Read it!" Howard commanded, his voice dripping with absolute, unquestionable authority. "And then sign it right now." I glanced down at the paper without moving my head. The bold capitalized header across the top page read, "Power of Attorney and Asset Reassignment Mandate." It was a staggering display of audacity. Howard stood tall, adjusting the cuffs of his cashmere sweater, fully believing he was delivering a masterstroke of paternal discipline. He informed me that he had spent the last hour on the phone with his personal legal counsel, drafting this emergency order. According to my father, my actions this morning proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that I had suffered a complete psychotic break. I was mentally unstable, erratic, and utterly incapable of managing my own affairs. The document was a legally binding mandate demanding I immediately sign over control of my checking accounts, my apartment lease, and all of my personal assets directly to Jamal. Furthermore, it permanently stripped me of my accounting credentials and formally transferred all bookkeeping responsibilities for his holding company to my brother-in-law. He actually believed Jamal was the competent, reliable businessman who needed to take the reins of my pathetic life to save the family from further embarrassment. He stated that I was acting out of bitter, unhinged jealousy and that giving Jamal control of my finances was the only way to ensure I could not orchestrate any more petty sabotage. He wanted to place my meager, insignificant net worth under the protective custody of a man he considered a financial genius. Before I could even fully process the sheer delusional insanity of his demand, Cynthia rose from her chair to join the assault. She glided across the Persian rug, positioning herself shoulder to shoulder with Howard, creating a unified, impenetrable wall of parental disgust. She did not yell. Cynthia never yelled. Instead, she utilized that quiet, razor-sharp tone she had perfected over decades, the one designed to slice directly through self-esteem and leave nothing but bleeding insecurities behind. She looked me up and down, her eyes lingering on my tailored suit with a look of supreme distaste as if I were wearing rags. She launched into a relentless verbal tirade, methodically dismantling every aspect of my life. She called my career a complete joke, a dead-end cubicle job that I used as an excuse to avoid forming actual human connections. She mocked my solitary lifestyle, pointing out that while Brittany was building a beautiful, vibrant family with a highly successful husband, I was sitting alone in a sterile apartment, growing more bitter and resentful with each passing year. "You are 30 years old, Riley," she stated, her words coated in a toxic, suffocating pity. "You have no husband, you have no children, you have absolutely nothing to show for your life. And instead of looking inward and fixing your own profound shortcomings, you decided to lash out at your sister. You decided to try and sabotage her perfect family out of pure venomous spite." She accused me of being so fundamentally eaten up by jealousy over Brittany's luxurious life, her beautiful home, and her wealthy husband that I had resorted to criminal behavior just to make them suffer for a single morning. She went on to explain how deeply embarrassed they were to call me their daughter, how they had constantly made excuses to their country club friends for my awkwardness and my lack of ambition, hoping I would eventually grow out of this miserable phase. But today she claimed I had crossed a line that could not be ignored. I was actively trying to destroy the only successful child they had produced. Cynthia pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the document resting on the table, demanding I pick up the silver pen resting beside it and sign my independence away. She promised that once Jamal was in control of my pathetic savings, they would kindly arrange for me to see a psychiatrist to deal with my dangerous inferiority complex. They would generously pay for the therapy, she added, as if offering me the ultimate olive branch. They were framing the complete theft of my autonomy as an act of loving parental intervention. I stood perfectly still, letting the toxic wave of their combined assault wash over me. In the past, this exact coordinated attack would have brought me to my knees. It would have reduced me to a sobbing, apologizing mess, desperate to regain their conditional, fleeting affection. I would have picked up the pen and signed whatever they demanded just to make the screaming stop. I would have believed every horrible thing they said about me. But today, their words held absolutely no power. They were not wielding weapons, they were waving cardboard swords at a tank. I looked at the mandate on the table. It was a laughable, amateurish document drafted by people who had absolutely zero comprehension of the financial apocalypse sitting right in front of them. They were trying to confiscate my meager savings to punish me, completely blind to the fact that I already owned the roof over their heads, the clothes on their backs, and the very ground they were standing on. They demanded I surrender my assets to Jamal. The sheer delicious irony of that demand was almost too much to bear. They wanted me to hand my wealth over to a man whose entire corporate existence had been vaporized by a single keystroke from my tablet less than an hour ago. Jamal was currently sitting on that velvet love seat, pale and sweating, knowing full well he was entirely bankrupt. Yet he remained perfectly silent while my parents tried to hand him my money. The disconnect between their arrogant perception of reality and the brutal, objective truth was staggering. I let Cynthia finish her monologue, allowing the silence to return to the drawing room, savoring the final moments of their ignorant bliss. I let Cynthia finish her monologue, allowing the silence to return to the drawing room, savoring the final moments of their ignorant bliss. The last echoes of her toxic speech faded into the heavy velvet drapes. The silver pen sat innocently beside the absurd legal document, glinting in the muted light of the room. Howard and Cynthia stared at me, their faces flush with the exertion of their perceived victory. They expected me to break. They expected the weight of their combined authority to crush my resistance, just as it always had when I was a child. Instead, I reached forward. I did not pick up the pen. I picked up the stack of stapled legal paper. With slow, deliberate precision, I gripped the top and bottom of the thick manila pages. The sound of tearing paper was deafening in the quiet space. I ripped the power of attorney mandate clean in half. Then, maintaining steady eye contact with my father, I stacked the halves and tore them again. I let the shredded remnants flutter down onto the polished mahogany coffee table, burying the silver pen under a pile of useless confetti. Howard shot up from his chair, his face instantly turning a dangerous shade of crimson. "Are you out of your mind?" he bellowed, the veins in his neck bulging against his crisp collar. Cynthia gasped, bringing a hand to her pearls, completely scandalized by the blatant destruction of a legal decree. Brittany let out a sharp squeak from the love seat, clutching Jamal's arm in a desperate panic. But Jamal remained completely paralyzed. His eyes were wide and hollow, finally realizing that the woman standing before them was not a subordinate throwing a tantrum. He knew exactly what kind of power I wielded, and he knew I was about to unleash it. I ignored my father's outrage. I reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out a different kind of document. It was a thick, heavy dossier bound in dark navy leather. Stamped across the front cover in bold, undeniable red ink was a single word: audit. I held it up for a brief second, ensuring the crimson letters registered in Howard's furious eyes. Then, with a flick of my wrist, I dropped the massive file onto the coffee table. It landed with a loud, heavy thud, scattering the shredded pieces of their pathetic mandate across the Persian rug. "You want to talk about financial management, Howard?" I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal register that froze him in his tracks. "Let us talk about your unparalleled business acumen." I stepped closer to the table, pointing a single manicured finger at the Navy dossier. That is a comprehensive forensic analysis of the Apex Holdings subsidiary portfolio. The exact blind trust you believe is currently protecting your assets and shielding your precious social standing. I turned my gaze to my mother, who was now gripping the armrests of her chair, a flicker of genuine uncertainty replacing her previous arrogance. 2 years ago, Cynthia, you and Howard came to a terrifying realization. Your golden boy Jamal, the tech visionary who was supposed to elevate our family name into the stratosphere, was hemorrhaging cash. His startup was not just failing, it was a catastrophic, unmitigated black hole of debt. Jamal whimpered a pathetic, strangled noise that he desperately tried to suppress. Brittany turned to him, her tear-stained face twisting in confusion. "What is she talking about?" Brittany demanded, shaking his arm. "Jamal, what is she saying?" I did not let him answer. "They did not tell you, Brittany." I continued, savoring the absolute destruction of their carefully curated illusions. "They did not want to burst your perfect bubble." 2 years ago, Jamal went crying to Howard. His investors were pulling out. The banks were calling in his commercial loans. He was facing public ruin and criminal fraud charges for misappropriating venture capital. So your esteemed parents decided to play the heroes. They decided to secretly bail him out to protect the precious family image. Howard opened his mouth to speak to deny the accusations, but his voice failed him completely. He stared at the red-stamped audit file as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. They could not use the legacy trust. I explained, my words cutting through the air like broken glass. Because as I established earlier today with Jamal, that trust was already completely drained by Howard's previous commercial real estate disasters. They had absolutely zero liquid capital, so they did the only thing they could do. They quietly, desperately took out a massive second mortgage on this exact estate. I gestured widely around the opulent drawing room, taking in the antique furniture, the custom woodwork, and the original oil paintings. They leveraged the family mansion, the very roof over your heads, to the absolute maximum limit. And they handed every single cent of that equity directly to Jamal. "No." Cynthia breathed, her voice trembling so violently she could barely form the word. "That was supposed to be a temporary loan. A bridge. Jamal promised he would repay it within 6 months once his software launched." I let out a harsh, unforgiving laugh. "There was no software, Cynthia. There was no launch. He used your second mortgage to pay off his most aggressive creditors and keep up the facade of his luxury lifestyle. He burned through the equity of this house, just like he burned through everything else. And because you orchestrated this entire bailout through the Apex Holdings subsidiary to keep it off your personal credit reports, you handed the debt directly to me." I leaned over the mahogany table, placing my hands flat on the polished surface, looking directly into my father's terrified eyes. "I own the subsidiary, Howard. That means I hold the note on the second mortgage. I own the debt. I own the leverage. I own this house." The blood completely drained from Howard's face. The formidable patriarch, the man who had just threatened to ruin my life and expel me from the financial sector, collapsed back into his wing chair, as if all the bones in his body had suddenly turned to dust. "You wanted me to sign over my meager assets," I said softly, the irony thick and heavy in the room. "You wanted to give Jamal control of my finances. But Jamal has nothing. You have nothing. The only reason the bank has not foreclosed on this estate and thrown you out onto the street is because I have been quietly making the massive mortgage payments out of my personal corporate accounts for the last 24 months. I have been paying the ransom to keep you in this castle." I picked up my leather tote bag and adjusted the strap over my shoulder. The silence in the drawing room was absolute. It was not the oppressive staged silence of a tribunal. It was the breathless, suffocating silence of total ruin. Brittany was staring at Jamal in absolute horror, her perfect life evaporating before her eyes as he refused to look up from his shoes. Cynthia had a trembling hand pressed over her mouth, tears ruining her perfectly applied makeup. Howard was paralyzed, staring blankly at the shredded mandate on the table, a king who had just realized his crown was made of paper. I did not ask for an apology. I did not demand submission. The brutal, undeniable truth was far more powerful than any forced confession. I turned my back on the shattered remnants of my family and walked toward the heavy double doors. I pushed them open and stepped out into the main hall, leaving them trapped in a state of stunned, breathless silence to finally face the devastating reality of their own making. The fallout from the drawing room execution was absolute, but desperate men rarely surrender quietly. 3 days after I shattered the foundation of my family's fabricated empire, the security console on my mahogany desk chimed softly. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and the panoramic view from my top-floor executive suite offered a pristine look at the Chicago skyline. My personal assistant, Elena, informed me via the intercom that there was a volatile situation unfolding in the main lobby of our skyscraper. I accessed the ground floor security feed on my dual monitors. There they were, Jamal and my insufferable nephew, Braden. They had somehow bypassed the outer pedestrian perimeter and were standing in the center of the soaring glass-walled atrium of the Apex Holdings corporate headquarters. Jamal was practically vibrating with unhinged rage, his face flushed, wearing a wrinkled suit that looked like he had slept in it for 3 consecutive nights. Braden, ever the arrogant extension of his father's toxic ego, was hovering right beside him. The teenager had his smartphone raised high, the red recording light blinking steadily. He was broadcasting live, preparing to publicly humiliate the aunt he firmly believed was a low-level, miserable cubicle drone. I watched through the high-definition cameras as Jamal cornered one of my uniformed security guards. He was shouting, jabbing his finger toward the marble reception desk, loudly demanding to see my immediate supervisor. He was banking on the delusion that I was merely a disposable, disgruntled employee. He wanted to drag me down to the lobby, scream about my alleged psychological instability, and have me fired right in front of Braden's digital audience. He wanted to reclaim a fraction of his lost masculinity by destroying my livelihood. I did not call the police to have them forcefully ejected. That would have been too easy, too swift. I wanted to look them in the eye. I stood up, smoothed the lapels of my tailored navy blazer, and made my way to the private executive elevator. The descent was smooth, silent, and deeply satisfying. As the polished steel doors slid open onto the expansive marble floor of the main lobby, the chaotic echo of Jamal's screaming immediately filled my ears. "Where is she?" Jamal bellowed, slamming his palm against the reception counter, startling the young woman behind the desk. "I know she works in this building. Get her manager down here right now. I'm going to see her fired before I leave this lobby." Braden was panning his phone around the grand, modern space, catching the sleek indoor water features and the massive steel logo of Apex Holdings mounted on the back wall. "We are going to expose her live on stream," he sneered into the camera, playing up his arrogant persona for whatever pathetic following he possessed. "My crazy aunt thinks she can mess with our family. We are about to get her terminated from her little desk job." I stepped out of the private elevator alcove, my heels clicking sharply against the imported Italian marble. The rhythmic, commanding sound cut through the ambient noise of the lobby. The security detail, recognizing me, instantly stepped back and stood at absolute attention. Jamal whipped his head around, his eyes locking onto mine. "There you are," he snarled, taking an aggressive step forward, completely misreading the deference the guards were showing me. He pointed a trembling finger at my chest. "You think you can hide behind your corporate firewall, Riley? You think you can destroy my company and steal my father-in-law's house without consequences? I am going to tear your life apart." I did not stop walking until I was standing less than 3 feet away from him. I glanced briefly at Braden, whose phone was aimed directly at my face, capturing every second of this encounter. I gave the camera a cold, vacant smile. "You are currently trespassing in the primary commercial headquarters of Apex Holdings, Jamal." I stated, my voice echoing clearly through the atrium, perfectly audible for Braden's live broadcast. "This building is not a public forum for your bankrupt tantrums. I am not leaving until your boss comes down here." Jamal roared, his face turning a deeper shade of crimson. He was too blinded by his own panic to notice that the entire lobby had fallen silent, and that every employee present was staring at him in sheer horror. I want the regional manager. I want the vice president. I am going to tell them exactly what kind of malicious, unstable liability they have on their payroll. I am going to see you pack your miserable little cardboard box today. I looked at the security captain, a towering man named Marcus, who was waiting for my signal. Then I turned my attention back to my brother-in-law. The absolute lack of comprehension was staggering. You clearly failed to perform a rudimentary background check before storming my lobby, I replied, keeping my posture relaxed and authoritative. Or perhaps your panic over impending homelessness has completely clouded your reading comprehension. I gestured to the massive brushed steel logo mounted behind the reception desk. Apex Holdings is not my employer, Jamal. It is my creation. I am the founder, the chief executive officer, and the sole majority shareholder of this entire corporate entity. Jamal froze. The aggressive posturing vanished, replaced by a sudden sickening confusion. He stared at me, then looked up at the towering ceiling of the skyscraper, the polished marble, the synchronized security team, and the absolute luxury of the space. I do not have a boss, Jamal. I continued, my words striking like surgical incisions. I do not work in a cubicle. I own the building. I employ the security team that is currently preparing to physically remove you. And I am the singular authority who dismantled your fraudulent startup 3 days ago. Braden's arm slowly lowered the smartphone, dipping toward the floor, as the reality of the situation crashed into his teenage brain. The live stream audience he had hoped to entertain was now witnessing the spectacular, irreversible humiliation of his own father. The smug sneer wiped completely off his face, leaving only pale, wide-eyed terror. "That is impossible," Jamal gasped, taking a stumbling step backward. "You are an accountant. You just manage ledgers." "I manage billions," I corrected him smoothly, enjoying the raw terror expanding in his eyes. "And right now I am managing a pest control issue." I gave Marcus a subtle nod. The security captain and 2 other heavily built guards immediately stepped forward, closing the distance between themselves and the 2 intruders. "Escort these unauthorized individuals off my property," I instructed, my voice ringing out with absolute finality. "If they resist, involve law enforcement. If they ever step foot within 100 yards of this building again, press charges for criminal trespassing." "Wait. Riley," Jamal stammered, the fight completely draining out of him. He held his hands up in a pathetic gesture of surrender. "Please, you have to listen to me." "I do not have to listen to anything," I replied, turning my back on him before he could formulate another desperate excuse. I walked back toward the private executive elevator, not bothering to look over my shoulder, as Marcus and his team forcefully corralled Jamal and Braden toward the revolving glass doors. The sound of Jamal's pleading was quickly muffled by the heavy glass shutting behind them. I stepped into the elevator, pressed the button for the top floor, and watched the marble lobby shrink away. They had come to humiliate a subordinate, but they had merely broadcast their own execution to the world. The elevator had barely cleared the 3rd floor when my secure line buzzed. It was Marcus, the security captain. His voice was tense, battling against the loud, echoing shouts vibrating in the background. He informed me that Jamal was violently resisting the escort. He was actively claiming to be an executive board member of Apex Holdings, threatening to file massive lawsuits against the entire security team, and screaming that he owned a 20% stake in the building. Braden, meanwhile, was actively inciting the growing crowd of onlookers, angling his smartphone to capture the confrontation, feeding his father's inflated, desperate ego. I tapped the stop button on the elevator panel, bringing the car to a smooth halt. I redirected the cab to the 50th floor. If Jamal wanted a legal spectacle for his son's live stream, I would oblige him. The elevator hummed to a stop, and I stepped out into the plush, silent corridor of the legal department. I walked straight into the corner office of Ms. Gallagher, my lead corporate attorney. She was a brilliant, razor-sharp litigator who had personally overseen the creation of the Blind Trust. She was already reviewing the live security feed on her monitor, watching Jamal's pathetic resistance with clinical detachment. "He is attempting to invoke squatters' rights in a commercial lobby," Gallagher noted dryly, standing up and smoothing her immaculate blazer. "I have the formal cease and desist orders ready, as well as the expedited eviction notices for the Lake Forest estate." Perfect, I replied, adjusting the cuffs of my tailored suit. Let us go end this permanently. We bypassed the standard employee lifts and moved directly to the private glass-enclosed executive elevator. It was a sleek, transparent cylinder that ran down the exterior spine of the grand atrium, fully visible to everyone in the expansive lobby below. Two of Gallagher's personal security contractors, massive men wearing dark suits and earpieces, fell into step behind us, their presence adding a heavy layer of undeniable authority. As the glass box began its smooth descent, I looked down at the chaotic scene unfolding on the marble floor. Jamal had managed to shake off Marcus's initial grip. He was pacing in a tight circle near the reception desk, puffing out his chest, pointing aggressively at the security staff. He was putting on a desperate show of dominance, an arrogant posture designed to intimidate the working-class guards who he firmly believed were beneath his fabricated social status. Braden was right beside him, the smartphone still hoisted high, narrating the incident to his digital audience, completely unaware of the incoming devastation. Then the soft, distinct chime of the executive elevator echoed through the cavernous atrium. The situation flipped instantly. The glass doors slid open with a quiet whisper, and I stepped out onto the polished marble floor. I was immaculate, unbothered, and radiating absolute control. Ms. Gallagher walked in perfect synchronization at my right shoulder, clutching the heavy legal dossier, while the two massive security guards flanked us, their expressions carved from solid stone. The reaction of the lobby was immediate and absolute. The receptionists stood up straight behind their monitors, bowing their heads slightly in respect. The entire security detail, including Marcus, immediately parted ways, creating a wide, unobstructed path for me. They greeted me with absolute reverence, murmuring my name in unison, their posture reflecting total deference. Jamal's arrogant posture dissolved into sheer, unadulterated confusion. He stopped pacing. His arms dropped to his sides. He watched the entire staff defer to me. He saw the genuine, unquestioning respect I commanded in this massive corporate fortress. His brain visibly short-circuited as he desperately tried to reconcile the image of his supposedly pathetic low-level sister-in-law with the untouchable corporate titan currently striding toward him. The blustering threats died in his throat. His shoulders slumped, and the color drained from his face for the second time that day, but this time it was accompanied by the crushing weight of public reality. "What is this?" Jamal stammered, his eyes darting frantically between the reverent guards and Ms. Gallagher. "Who are these people?" "This is my lead counsel, Ms. Gallagher," I stated, my voice echoing clearly in the quiet lobby, perfectly capturing the acoustics for Braden's live broadcast. "And you are currently making an absolute fool of yourself in my building." Gallagher stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the stone. She did not raise her voice. She spoke with the icy, lethal precision of a predator closing in on its prey. Jamal Davis Gallagher began holding out the thick dossier. "You are hereby served with a formal, legally binding cease and desist order regarding any further harassment, contact, or attempted financial manipulation of my client, Riley Wilson. Furthermore, as you are currently trespassing on private commercial property owned exclusively by Apex Holdings, you are officially barred from this premises. Any future attempt to enter this building will result in immediate arrest and prosecution." Jamal stared at the documents, completely paralyzed. He did not reach out to take them, so Gallagher simply dropped the heavy file onto his chest. He fumbled to catch it, clutching the papers awkwardly against his wrinkled suit. "Wait!" Braden interjected, his voice cracking slightly. He kept the phone aimed at us, but the smug, entitled confidence was entirely gone. "You cannot do this. My dad is an executive. He is rich." I turned my gaze to my nephew, feeling a fleeting sliver of pity for the boy who had been raised on toxic lies. "Your father is a fraud, Braden. He is entirely bankrupt. The sports car you drove here in was repossessed this morning because the lease was in my name, and I canceled it. The designer clothes on his back were purchased with my corporate credit cards. And as of an hour ago, the bank accounts he uses to fund your lifestyle have been permanently frozen." Braden lowered his phone slightly, looking at his father for reassurance. "Dad, tell her she is lying. Tell them to back off." Jamal could not speak. He was clutching the legal documents, his eyes wide and vacant. The live stream was still running, broadcasting his total humiliation to his peers, his friends, and whatever remaining social circle he possessed. He had brought his son here to witness my execution, but he had only succeeded in permanently destroying his own legacy in the eyes of his child. In addition to the cease and desist, Gallagher continued mercilessly tapping the top of the dossier in Jamal's arms. This packet includes a formal 30-day notice of eviction for the Lake Forest estate. Since the property is heavily leveraged under a secondary mortgage held entirely by Apex Holdings, and those payments are now strictly in default, the foreclosure process has been expedited. You, your wife, and your in-laws have exactly 1 month to vacate the premises before local law enforcement physically removes you. Jamal's knees literally buckled. He swayed, catching himself on the edge of the marble reception desk to keep from collapsing onto the floor. The illusion of his power, his wealth, and his status was gone. It had not just been stripped away, it had been surgically extracted and paraded in front of him. You planned this. Jamal choked out his voice, barely a raspy whisper. You set us up from the beginning. I funded your existence for 2 years. I corrected him, my tone devoid of any sympathy or warmth. I gave you every opportunity to build a legitimate business, and you squandered it on pure vanity. I did not set you up, Jamal. I simply stopped paying for the privilege of your arrogance. I turned to Marcus, who was standing by with quiet satisfaction. Escort Mr. Davis and his son to the street. Ensure they do not linger on the sidewalk. Marcus nodded, gesturing for his team to move in. This time Jamal did not resist. He did not shout. He did not threaten to sue. He was a hollow, broken shell of a man shuffling blindly toward the revolving glass doors, clutching the legal documents that detailed his total ruin. Braden followed closely behind his phone, finally lowered to his side. The live stream abruptly terminated. The silence they left in their wake was absolute. I turned to Ms. Gallagher, offering a brief, appreciative nod. Excellent timing as always. Always a pleasure to serve the truth, Ms. Wilson, she replied smoothly. I stood in the center of the grand lobby for a moment, absorbing the pristine atmosphere. The staff seamlessly returned to their stations, moving with a quiet, respectful efficiency. The building was secure. The threat had been permanently neutralized. The years of enduring their condescension, their insults, and their financial parasitism were finally over. I turned and walked back toward the executive elevator, the glass doors sliding open to welcome me. The ascent back to the top floor was swift and smooth, carrying me away from the wreckage of their lives and back into the empire I had built with my own 2 hands. My heel hovered over the threshold of the executive elevator. The polished steel doors were just beginning to glide shut when a harsh, guttural shout echoed across the atrium. Jamal ripped his arm out of Marcus's grip. He was not finished. A man whose entire identity was built on arrogance could not simply walk away in silence. He needed a final word, a desperate attempt to claw back his dignity in front of his teenage son. "You can have the house, Riley," he screamed, his voice cracking with manic desperation. "You can have that overpriced suburban trap. I do not care. My startup is launching its beta next month. We are finalizing our Series C funding. I am going to have a valuation of $50 million by the 4th quarter. I am going to hire a team of corporate litigators, and I will sue you for every penny you possess. I will bury you." Encouraged by his father's sudden burst of false bravado, Braden quickly hoisted his smartphone back into the air. His thumb tapped the screen, and the red recording light blinked back to life. He pointed the camera directly at my face, a cruel, triumphant sneer warping his young features. You hear that he taunted, his voice loud enough to ensure his digital audience caught every syllable. "My dad is a tech genius. You are just a vindictive, jealous aunt who got lucky. We are going to expose this illegal eviction to everyone. You are done." I signaled Marcus with a sharp, flat motion of my hand. The security captain immediately halted his advance, allowing Jamal and Braden a few precious feet of space. I stepped away from the elevator. The doors slid closed behind me with a soft chime sealing off my exit. I did not need to retreat. I turned and walked slowly back across the expanse of the marble floor, my gaze locked entirely on the glowing lens of Braden's smartphone. I stopped less than an arm's length from the device. I did not look at Jamal. I looked directly into the camera, addressing the hundreds of nameless viewers watching this spectacle unfold in real time. Let us clarify the current state of your father's business empire, Braden. I said, my voice perfectly level and deadly calm. Since you are broadcasting this to the world, it is only fair that your audience receives accurate financial reporting. I shifted my gaze to Jamal. The manic spark in his eyes faltered, replaced by a sudden creeping dread. Your Series C funding round collapsed 6 weeks ago, Jamal, I stated, projecting my voice so it carried cleanly across the lobby. Your lead venture capitalist discovered that you had been fabricating your user acquisition metrics. They realized your beta software was a useless buggy shell. You were burning through their capital to fund your country club memberships and luxury car leases. They panicked, they wanted out, and they were desperate to offload your toxic debt for pennies on the dollar to avoid a total loss on their balance sheets. Jamal's jaw dropped. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a polished mannequin. They could not find a buyer. I continued, taking a slow, deliberate step closer. Because everyone in the tech sector knew your company was a sinking ship. Everyone except me. My venture capital division stepped in yesterday afternoon. We bought out every single one of your investors. We purchased your commercial loans, your outstanding vendor invoices, and your defaulted credit lines. We bought it all. No, Jamal whispered, shaking his head side to side. You cannot do that. The board would have to approve a buyout. You violated the covenant of your initial operating agreement the moment you missed your 4th consecutive loan payment, I informed him, watching his entire world fracture. The debt automatically converted to equity upon default. As of 9 o'clock this morning, my firm executed a hostile takeover of your entire startup. I hold 85% of the voting shares. I am the absolute majority shareholder. I own your company. Braden was breathing heavily, his arms shaking so badly that the smartphone camera was visibly trembling. He looked at his father, waiting for Jamal to deny it, waiting for the tech genius to fire back with a brilliant countermeasure. But Jamal was silent. He was swaying on his feet, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. And as the majority shareholder, it is my primary fiduciary duty to trim the fat and eliminate bloated, ineffective management, I announced, turning my attention back to the camera lens. I looked directly at Jamal. Right here, right now, effective immediately, you are officially terminated from the company you founded. You are fired, Jamal. He let out a pathetic, strangled gasp. Your corporate access is permanently revoked, I stated, delivering the final fatal blows with surgical precision. Your access to the company's servers, your email accounts, and your digital infrastructure has already been severed. The company vehicle you drove here is currently being towed from our parking structure. You have absolutely zero authority, zero assets, and zero equity. You are nothing but a disgraced, unemployed fraud. The sheer magnitude of the destruction finally penetrated Braden's arrogant facade. The reality of his father's absolute bankruptcy hit him with the force of a freight train. His hands went completely slack. The smartphone slipped from his grip. It tumbled through the air and smashed onto the imported Italian marble floor with a sharp, violent crack. The screen shattered into a spiderweb of broken glass, instantly terminating the live broadcast and plunging his audience into darkness. Braden stared at this broken phone at his feet, his entire body trembling violently. He did not say a word. He did not attempt to retrieve the shattered device. He just stood there, completely broken. Marcus, I said, breaking the heavy silence that had fallen over the atrium. Please escort these 2 unemployed individuals out of my building. Ensure they are placed firmly on the public sidewalk. Marcus stepped forward with immediate, decisive action. He grabbed Jamal by the elbow. The former tech CEO did not resist. He allowed himself to be dragged toward the revolving doors, his eyes glazed over, his spirit entirely crushed. A second guard gently but firmly steered a sobbing Braden by the shoulder, guiding the terrified teenager out into the harsh afternoon sunlight. I watched the glass doors spin, depositing them onto the concrete pavement. The hostile takeover was complete. The cancer that had infected my family and drained my finances for years was finally permanently eradicated. I turned on my heel and walked toward the executive elevator ready to return to work. The heavy glass doors glided shut, sealing off the lobby and carrying me back up to the serene, absolute isolation of my office. For a brief moment during that ascent, I allowed myself to believe the war was finally over. I assumed the sheer crushing reality of total bankruptcy, public humiliation, and impending eviction would finally force my parents into a state of quiet submission. I vastly underestimated the bottomless depth of their delusion. 48 hours later, Ms. Gallagher walked into my suite without knocking. She did not look triumphant. She looked professionally offended as she placed a thin gray folder directly in the center of my desk. "They are not packing," Gallagher stated, her tone sharp and clipped. "They are buying orchids." I opened the folder. Inside were copies of wire transfers and heavily redacted contractual agreements sourced by my corporate intelligence team. Howard and Cynthia were not preparing to vacate the Lake Forest estate. They were aggressively moving forward with their lavish 35th wedding anniversary gala, an event they had pretentiously dubbed the Sapphire Jubilee, scheduled for this coming Saturday at the ultra-exclusive Oak Ridge Country Club. I stared at the numbers on the page, my mind struggling to process the absolute insanity of their actions. Their bank accounts were frozen, their credit lines were terminated. Jamal's startup, their final desperate gamble, was now entirely under my control. They did not have the liquid capital to buy a cup of coffee, let alone fund a six-figure high society ball. How, I asked, looking up at my lead counsel. "Howard found a shadow lender." Gallagher explained, her expression grim. "A notoriously aggressive private equity firm, operating just outside the boundaries of federal regulation. He took out a short-term, high-yield predatory loan. $500,000 at an extortionate 35% interest rate. He collateralized the remaining luxury vehicles, Cynthia's entire designer jewelry collection, and a stash of antique bearer bonds he managed to hide from the initial asset freeze. He leveraged the absolute last scraps of his existence just to pay the caterers, the florists, and the string quartet. It was a masterclass in denial. Rather than face their ruin, they had decided to double down on the facade, buying one final night of aristocratic glory with blood money they could never repay. Before I could fully digest the sheer absurdity of the shadow loan, Elena buzzed my intercom. A private courier had just delivered a certified envelope to the reception desk marked for my immediate personal attention. Gallagher retrieved it and handed it to me. I sliced open the heavy gold-embossed seal. It was a formal trespass warning printed on the official stationery of the Oak Ridge Country Club Board of Directors, personally signed by Cynthia. The document explicitly banned me from the premises for the entire weekend, threatening immediate police intervention and arrest if I came within a 1-mile radius of the venue. Attached was a handwritten note from my mother stating that my toxic, unstable presence would not be permitted to infect their milestone celebration. I dropped the warning into my recycling bin. I had absolutely no intention of attending their pathetic masquerade, but the preemptive ban proved exactly how terrified they were of the objective truth leaking out. They needed a controlled environment. They needed a captive audience. Saturday evening arrived, bringing with it a torrential downpour that perfectly matched the bleak reality my parents were actively ignoring. I remained in the quiet comfort of my penthouse apartment, reviewing quarterly projections on my tablet, while rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows. I did not need to be at the Oak Ridge Country Club to know exactly what was happening. My corporate network was vast, and several of my investors and board members happened to share a social circle with Howard and Cynthia. At 8 o'clock, my phone lit up with the first text message. It was from Marcus Vance, the head of a prominent hedge fund and a key ally in my recent acquisitions. He was attending the gala and had promised to keep me entertained. The first message contained a photo. The grand ballroom of the country club had been transformed into a winter wonderland of blue ice sculptures, imported white orchids hanging from the chandeliers, and towering pyramids of vintage champagne. In the center of the frame stood Howard, wearing a custom tuxedo, his face slick with an unnatural sweat, gripping a crystal flute as if it were a life preserver. Beside him was Cynthia, draped in the very diamond necklace that currently belonged to a predatory loan shark. They were grinning with a manic, unhinged energy. The second message from Marcus arrived 10 minutes later. The text was blunt. "Your father has lost his mind." I set my tablet down and called Marcus directly. He answered on the first ring, the sophisticated hum of the string quartet and the clatter of expensive silverware echoing clearly in the background. "What is he doing?" I asked, my voice flat. "He is holding court by the ice bar," Marcus replied, his tone laced with absolute disbelief. "He is currently telling the mayor, the district attorney, and half the city council that you are the target of a massive federal grand jury investigation. He is claiming that your venture capital firm is a front for international money laundering and that the FBI is preparing to raid your corporate headquarters on Monday morning." I closed my eyes, letting the sheer toxicity of the lie wash over me. It was not enough for them to live in denial. They had to actively destroy my reputation to explain their impending unavoidable downfall. If they were ruined, it had to be because they were the innocent victims of my vast criminal enterprise. "And Cynthia?" I asked. Marcus sighed heavily. "She is working the tables. She just told my wife that you orchestrated a hostile takeover of Jamal's startup using stolen cartel funds. She is whispering to anyone who will listen that the stress of your impending arrest is what caused the rift in the family. They are framing themselves as tragic heroes, trying to distance their pristine legacy from your criminal behavior. They were spinning a web of vicious, desperate rumors, attempting to assassinate my character before the reality of their bankruptcy hit the local papers. They believed that if they repeated the lies loudly enough, and to the right people, they could somehow manifest a different reality. They were pouring the last drops of their stolen money into a delusion so grand it defied basic human logic. "Keep enjoying the champagne, Marcus," I said smoothly. "Let them talk, let them spin whatever fairy tale helps them sleep tonight." I ended the call and tossed my phone onto the sofa. I did not feel a trace of anger. I felt nothing but a cold, clinical fascination. Howard and Cynthia were dancing on the deck of a sinking ship, clinking glasses and spreading poison, completely blind to the dark, unforgiving water rushing in beneath their feet. They had bought their final night of glory, but the bill would come due with the sunrise, and there would be no one left to pay it. I watched the city lights blur through the rain-streaked glass of my penthouse. I had fully intended to let Howard and Cynthia dance the night away in their fabricated reality. I was perfectly content to let the predatory lenders tear them apart on Monday morning while I reviewed my quarterly earnings. But as another text from Marcus illuminated my screen, this one detailing Howard's arrogant boast about a fictitious charitable foundation he claimed to be launching using family funds, a cold spark of inspiration ignited in my chest. A silent morning foreclosure was too sterile. A delusion of this magnitude, funded by toxic shadow money and built on the active assassination of my character, demanded a spectacular public demolition. I picked up my phone and called Ms. Gallagher. We arrived at the Oak Ridge Country Club 45 minutes later. The storm outside was a violent, chaotic backdrop to the opulent, insulated sanctuary within. The valet, recognizing my vehicle and perhaps sensing the lethal momentum in my stride, did not ask for an invitation. I bypassed the cloakroom entirely and walked straight down the grand carpeted corridor leading to the main ballroom. The muffled, sophisticated sound of a string quartet leaked through the heavy mahogany doors, accompanied by the low, steady hum of wealthy aristocrats trading gossip and sipping stolen champagne. I signaled the two private security contractors flanking Ms. Gallagher to hold their positions just out of sight in the hallway. I did not need physical force for this. I just needed the absolute, undeniable truth. I pushed the right door open just a fraction of an inch, slipping unnoticed into the velvet-draped shadows of the entrance. The room was a blinding display of financial recklessness. Sapphire blue uplighting cast an icy, ethereal glow across the massive crystal centerpieces. Waiters in pristine white gloves circled the tables like sharks offering silver trays of caviar and imported truffles. At the far end of the room, Howard stood proudly on a raised dais. He was tapping a silver spoon against a crystal champagne flute. The sharp, high-pitched ringing cut through the chatter, demanding absolute attention from the room. The string quartet obediently faded into silence. Howard adjusted his posture, puffing out his chest to project the image of a benevolent, untouchable patriarch. He cleared his throat, projecting his deep, practiced voice across the sea of designer gowns and tailored tuxedos. He spoke of the Wilson name as if it were a sacred, historical dynasty. He waxed poetic about generational prosperity, claiming that true wealth was measured not in bank accounts or stock portfolios, but in the unyielding integrity of family legacy. He had the absolute audacity to raise his glass to Cynthia, declaring her the unbreakable rock of their empire. He called her the woman who had helped him build a fortress that no external storm, and certainly no internal malicious betrayal, could ever breach. He was masterfully weaving his lies into the air, painting himself as the stoic, noble victim of a rebellious criminal daughter. He assured the captivated crowd that the Wilson legacy was more secure, more prosperous, and more unified tonight than it had ever been in their 35 years of marriage. It was the perfect cue. I stepped out of the shadows, gripped the brass handles of both heavy mahogany doors, and pushed them wide open. They hit the wall stops with a resounding, thunderous crack that echoed violently through the cavernous ballroom. Every single head in the room snapped toward the entrance simultaneously. I stood framed in the doorway, entirely unbothered by the hundreds of widened eyes suddenly bearing down on me. I wore a sharp charcoal gray trench coat over a tailored black dress, the rain still glistening faintly on my shoulders. Ms. Gallagher stood exactly one step behind me, her expression a mask of absolute terrifying legal execution. She was clutching a waterproof briefcase that held the forensic proof of their total annihilation. The silence that fell over the room was immediate and absolute. It was a thick, suffocating quiet, broken only by the sharp, rhythmic sound of my heels striking the polished hardwood floor as I began my descent toward the stage. The crowd parted instantly. Wealthy socialites, city council members, and arrogant business tycoons practically leaped out of my way, creating a wide, unobstructed path down the center aisle as if I were carrying a live explosive. The whispers died in their throats. The champagne glasses hovered motionless in the air. Up on the dais, Howard's arm remained frozen in mid-toast. The champagne in his raised flute trembled violently, sloshing over the delicate crystal rim and dripping down onto his custom cuff. His arrogant, practiced smile had been wiped away in a fraction of a second, replaced by the ashen, slack-jawed terror of a man watching his executioner march into his sanctuary. Cynthia, seated at the head table just below the stage, gripped the edges of her chair so hard her knuckles turned a stark, translucent white. Brittany and Jamal sat frozen beside her, looking as though they had just been turned to stone. I did not rush. I maintained a slow, measured, and completely dominant pace. I let the silence stretch, forcing every person in that room to feel the sudden crushing shift in power. I did not stop until I reached the direct center of the ballroom floor, standing right at the edge of the stage, looking up at the man who had just lied to half the city. I did not raise my voice. I did not hurl insults or launch into a theatrical monologue to match the one Howard had just delivered. I simply reached into the waterproof briefcase Ms. Gallagher held open at my side. I retrieved a single pristine white envelope completely unmarked and sealed with a sharp, precise crease. I extended my arm, offering the envelope up to my father. Howard stared at the crisp white paper as if it were a coiled rattlesnake. The microphone in his other hand slipped, letting out a sharp, piercing squeal of feedback that made several guests in the front row flinch and cover their ears. He slowly reached down his fingers, shaking so violently that he nearly dropped the envelope before he could grasp it. He fumbled with the seal, tearing the thick paper in his haste. He pulled out the single sheet of legal documentation inside. I watched his eyes scan the bold black text. I watched his pupils dilate. I watched the final pathetic illusion of his generational wealth evaporate into the cold, air-conditioned atmosphere of the country club. Miss Gallagher stepped forward. She did not need a microphone. Her voice was engineered for courtrooms and corporate boardrooms, and it sliced through the dead silence of the ballroom with absolute lethal clarity. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen." Ms. Gallagher began addressing the hundreds of stunned socialites, politicians, and business leaders who were hanging on her every word. "We apologize for the interruption to your evening. However, as the lead corporate counsel for Ms. Riley Wilson, I have a fiduciary duty to clarify a pressing financial matter regarding your hosts." A collective murmur rippled through the crowd, but a single sharp look from Gallagher silenced it instantly. 48 hours ago, Howard and Cynthia Wilson secured a $500,000 short-term bridge loan from Apex Capital Management to fund this very event. Gallagher stated, her words dropping like anvils onto the polished floor. It was a high-risk predatory loan carrying a 35% interest rate. What Howard failed to realize is that Apex Capital Management is a subsidiary shell company entirely owned and operated by my client's private shadow network. Howard stumbled backward, bumping heavily into the carved ice bar behind him. A heavy crystal bowl of caviar rattled ominously against the frozen sculpture. Cynthia shot up from her chair at the head table, her face contorting into a mask of sheer panic. "You loaned us the money!" Howard rasped the live microphone, amplifying his terrified whisper across the room. "We acquired your desperation," Ms. Gallagher corrected him flawlessly. "And we monitored your subsequent actions. The loan you signed contained strict covenants requiring full transparency of all remaining assets. In the last 24 hours, you intentionally breached those covenants by attempting to move hidden offshore funds and by utilizing fraudulent collateral to secure secondary lines of credit. These are massive intentional and criminal breaches of contract." Gallagher paused, letting the severity of the word criminal wash over the elite crowd. The mayor, standing near the front row, subtly took a step back, visibly distancing himself from my parents. "Because of these deliberate violations, the acceleration clause in your contract has been triggered." Ms. Gallagher announced, her voice ringing with finality. "The entire balance of the loan is due immediately. Since you possess zero liquid capital to satisfy this debt, my client has officially executed a total and complete freeze on every single bank account tied to your name, your trust, or your remaining physical collateral. You have no funds. You have no credit. You are entirely insolvent." "No," Cynthia shrieked. It was not a word. It was a visceral, horrifying sound that tore from her throat, echoing wildly off the high ceilings of the ballroom. She lunged forward, grabbing the edge of the stage, the heavy diamonds around her neck catching the blue uplighting. "You cannot do this to us. Not tonight. Not in front of our friends. Your friends are currently drinking champagne that you cannot pay for," Ms. Gallagher pointed out coldly. The reality of Gallagher's statement rippled through the room, but it hit the perimeter of the ballroom the fastest. At the back doors, the country club's senior event manager had been listening closely. He was a man who understood the fundamental rule of high society catering. You do not serve expensive food to bankrupt clients. I watched as the event manager tapped his earpiece, barking a rapid command to his floor captains. The shift was instantaneous and brutal. The waiters in pristine white gloves, who had been circulating the room with silver trays of warm hors d'oeuvres, suddenly stopped in their tracks. Without a single word of apology to the confused guests, they spun on their heels and marched directly back to the kitchen swinging doors. The bartenders stationed around the room swiftly began capping the open bottles of vintage champagne and pulling the top-shelf liquor from the lighted displays, packing the expensive bottles into heavy plastic transport crates. Cynthia watched the mass exodus of the service staff in absolute horror. She screamed again, a raw, desperate wail, waving her arms frantically at the retreating waiters. "Stop!" she demanded, her voice cracking as she leaned over the stage. "Bring that back. We are the Wilsons. We are paying you. We demand service. You are trespassing." Ms. Gallagher corrected her, raising a hand to signal the security contractors waiting out in the hall. The caterers ignored my mother entirely. A team of kitchen staff emerged carrying heavy industrial carts. They marched straight to the elaborate buffet stations that lined the eastern wall of the ballroom. In full view of the city's elite, they began violently dismantling the Sapphire Jubilee. They ripped the silver chafing dishes away from the heating elements. They scooped up the towering pyramids of imported macarons and dumped them unceremoniously into plastic storage bins. They dismantled the fresh oyster bars, tossing the carved ice and expensive seafood into large rolling coolers. The absolute indignity of the scene was staggering. The wealthy guests, previously captivated by Howard's pompous speech, now watched in morbid fascination as the entire luxury event was packed up in boxes right in front of their eyes. Some guests quietly set their half-empty champagne flutes down on the nearest tables and began inching toward the coat check, utterly unwilling to be associated with the unfolding catastrophe. Howard remained frozen on the dais. He was still clutching the white envelope, staring out at the chaotic dismantling of his final delusional triumph. The blue ice sculptures behind him were beginning to melt beneath the warm stage lights, water dripping steadily onto the polished wood. The string quartet had long since packed away their instruments and slipped out the side exit, leaving the room to the harsh clattering sounds of the catering crew. I stood in the exact center of the room, completely surrounded by the wreckage of their social standing. I had not spoken a single word since entering the grand ballroom. I did not need to. The silence was my absolute victory, and the frantic echoing sounds of caterers packing away the remnants of a fraudulent dynasty spoke far louder than any speech my father could have ever delivered. I turned my back on the unraveling disaster of the Sapphire Jubilee and walked out of the ballroom. The cold night air hit my face as I exited the country club, leaving my parents to drown in the shallow end of their own vanity. Ms. Gallagher departed in a separate car. Her briefcase secured our objective, flawlessly achieved. I directed my driver to take me straight home. The city blurred past the tinted windows, a streak of neon lights and rain-washed concrete. I needed the absolute silence of my private penthouse to decompress from the sheer toxicity of my family. My residence occupied the entire top floor of a secure, ultra-modern high-rise in the center of the financial district. It was a fortress of glass, steel, and biometric security, designed specifically to keep the chaos of the world at bay. I dismissed my driver, rode the private elevator up, and stepped into my sanctuary. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water, changed into comfortable silk loungewear, and settled into the leather chair in my study. The clock on the wall shifted to exactly midnight. The transition from peace to a full-scale security alert took less than 3 seconds. A silent, pulsing red light illuminated the master control panel on my desk. My smart home system did not blare a loud siren. I had designed it to be completely discreet, alerting only me to a perimeter breach. I tapped the glowing screen, bringing up the high-definition night vision camera feeds. Someone had bypassed the external service elevator and forced the secondary fire escape locks. I watched the monitor as 3 figures emerged onto my private rooftop terrace. The heavy rain had stopped, leaving the night sky clear and dark. The figures were dressed in dark clothing, their faces partially obscured by hoods, but the gait and arrogant posture of the one leading the pack were instantly recognizable. It was Braden. He had brought 2 friends. They looked like standard entitled private schoolboys attempting to play the role of hardened criminals. One was tall and gangly, clutching a heavy steel crowbar. The other was stocky, holding a large duffel bag and a heavy industrial flashlight. Braden was not carrying a weapon. He was gripping a brand new smartphone, the camera lens pointed directly at the heavy, reinforced glass doors of my living room. Pushed to the absolute brink of madness by his father's total ruin and the public humiliation he had endured earlier that day, the boy had decided to take matters into his own hands. I did not panic. I simply stood up from my desk and walked over to the false bookcase lining the back wall of my study. I pressed my thumb against the concealed scanner. The heavy wooden shelf clicked and swung open, revealing my reinforced security hub. I stepped inside, secured the steel door behind me, and sat down at the primary observation console. I had full audio and visual access to every square inch of my home. I watched them work. The tall boy swung the crowbar against the shatterproof glass. It bounced off with a dull thud. He tried again, putting his back into it. On the third strike, he managed to crack the locking mechanism on the sliding track. The doors gave way with a harsh groan, and the three teenagers spilled into my pristine, immaculate living room. "Turn the flashlights off." Braden hissed, his voice echoing clearly through my hidden speakers. "Keep the lights low, just follow the camera." He held the phone up the screen, glowing in the darkness. He was recording every second of their break-in. I watched in cold fascination as the absolute delusion of his father manifested in the son. Braden believed he was the star of a digital revolution. He thought he was executing a righteous mission of vengeance. "Tear it apart," Braden ordered, his voice cracking with a manic, unhinged energy. "Break everything. She took my dad's company. She took our house. I want this place wrecked." The two friends did not need to be told twice. They unleashed a wave of senseless, violent vandalism. The tall boy dragged his crowbar across my Italian leather sofa, tearing a massive, jagged gash through the expensive material. He swung the iron bar into a priceless porcelain vase resting on the console table, shattering it into 1,000 tiny white shards that rained across the hardwood floor. The stocky boy kicked over a heavy floor lamp, the bulb exploding with a loud pop, before he began pulling expensive art books off the shelves and hurling them across the room. Braden filmed all of it. He was breathing heavily, panning the camera across the destruction, narrating the chaos for whatever audience he intended to blackmail me with. "This is what happens when you mess with my family, Riley," he sneered into the camera, his face twisted in a mask of sweaty, misplaced rage. "You thought you could just take everything from us and walk away. You thought you were untouchable up here in your little glass tower. Well, look at your castle now." He gestured for his friends to follow him down the hallway toward my home office. I watched their progress on the monitors, my expression perfectly blank. They kicked the study door open and piled inside. "Find the safe," Braden commanded, shoving the tall boy toward my desk. "Find her hard drives. Find her physical ledgers. There has to be a locked cabinet in here. We are going to take every single corporate document she has. We are going to find her dirty secrets." The stocky boy began yanking drawers out of my desk, dumping perfectly organized files and stationery onto the floor. They were searching for leverage. Braden's master plan was as pathetic as it was criminal. He genuinely believed that if he stole my physical documents, he could hold them ransom. He thought he could extort a billionaire venture capitalist with a duffel bag full of tax returns and vendor contracts. "When we get the files, we contact her lawyers." Braden continued, speaking directly into the recording lens of his phone. He was essentially dictating a digital ransom note. "We hold all her corporate secrets hostage. She gives my dad his company back. She signs over the deed to the Lake Forest estate. She drops all the lawsuits and issues a public apology. If she refuses, I leak every single document to the dark web. I will post this video to every social media platform on Earth. I will show the world how weak she really is. I will destroy her." He was recording his own felonies in ultra-high definition. He was documenting a premeditated burglary, destruction of private property, and a direct verbal threat of extortion, all while standing in the middle of my study. It was a gift-wrapped conviction handed directly to my legal team. I reached out and placed my hand over the main security interface on my console. I bypassed the silent alarm protocol and directly engaged the lockdown mechanism. With a single tap of my finger, heavy reinforced steel shutters slammed down over the broken terrace doors and every single window in the penthouse. The electronic deadbolts on the front entrance engaged with a loud metallic clank. On the monitors, I watched Braden and his friends freeze in terror as the penthouse sealed them inside. The game was over. I picked up the direct line to Marcus and dialed. "Marcus," I said, my voice perfectly level despite the frantic shouting now echoing through my hidden security monitors. "Dispatch the police to my primary residence. 3 intruders are currently contained in the main living area. They have caused significant property damage and recorded a direct extortion threat. I have secured them inside. Do not let the responding officers breach the perimeter until I grant remote access." Marcus did not ask questions. He simply confirmed the order and disconnected. I leaned back in my leather chair and watched the monitors. The sudden deployment of the steel shutters had completely shattered their bravado. Braden threw his weight against the front door, yanking uselessly at the heavy brass handles. The biometric deadbolts held fast. The tall boy swung his steel crowbar at the reinforced window shutters, but the metal barely scratched. The loud ringing impact only seemed to amplify their rising panic. The stocky boy dropped his duffel bag, his hands pulling at his hair as he paced the ruined living room like a trapped animal. Braden's smartphone, the device he had intended to use as a weapon of blackmail, slipped from his sweaty grip and clattered onto the hardwood floor. The lens was still recording, capturing their complete descent from arrogant vandals to terrified trapped children. They had severely underestimated the boundaries of my world. It took exactly 4 minutes for the sirens to pierce the quiet night. The wailing grew louder, bouncing off the surrounding skyscrapers until flashing red and blue lights illuminated the street below. From my control hub, I accessed the building's external security interface and remotely authorized elevator access for the responding officers. I watched the hallway feed as 6 heavily armed police officers took positions outside my front door. With a single tap on my screen, I disengaged the biometric locks. The heavy doors swung inward. The officers flooded the penthouse with weapons drawn and tactical flashlights, piercing the dim interior. Commands were shouted, sharp and deafening. The boys did not resist. They dropped to their knees immediately. I watched as the tall boy let the crowbar roll away from his shaking hands. Officers shoved them face down onto the floor, securing their wrists with heavy steel handcuffs. The tough, unhinged energy Braden had displayed 10 minutes prior had completely evaporated. He was openly weeping, his face pressed against the ruined leather of my sofa, sobbing for his mother as an officer read him his Miranda rights. I stepped out of my secure study, my silk loungewear replaced by a sharp-tailored black coat. I walked calmly past the 3 trembling teenagers, completely ignoring Braden's desperate, tearful pleas directed at me. I handed the lead officer a flash drive containing the high-definition footage of their break and their vandalism and their extortion threat. I pointed a perfectly manicured finger at Braden's dropped smartphone on the floor. "That device contains the rest of your evidence," I stated smoothly. An hour later, I sat in the brightly lit, sterile environment of the Central Police Precinct. The sharp glare of the fluorescent lights offered a harsh contrast to the shadows of my penthouse, but I felt entirely at home in the rigid, rule-bound atmosphere. I had just finished signing my formal statement with the lead detective outlining the exact timeline of the felony break-in. The evidence was irrefutable. The boys were currently being processed, fingerprinted, and placed in holding cells. As I stood to leave the detective's desk, the heavy double doors of the precinct lobby flew open. Brittany and Jamal burst into the room. They looked frantic, their clothes hastily thrown on their faces, pale with absolute terror. They must have received the call from the booking officer. Their eyes frantically scanned the crowded lobby until they locked onto me. Brittany sprinted across the linoleum floor, nearly tripping over her own feet. Jamal was right behind her, breathing heavily. She shrieked my name, her voice echoing off the concrete walls and drawing the attention of every police officer and clerk in the room. She crashed to her knees right in front of me, grabbing the hem of my coat. Tears streamed down her face, ruining her makeup and making her look completely unhinged. "He is just a boy," Brittany sobbed, her fingers digging into my fabric. "He was upset about his father. He was not thinking straight. You cannot do this to him. You cannot ruin his life over a stupid mistake." Jamal dropped to his knees beside her, his hands clasped together in a desperate, pathetic display of submission. "They are charging him with multiple felonies." Jamal begged, his voice cracking with panic. "Breaking and entering, destruction of property, extortion. He will go to state prison. His entire future will be ruined. He will never get into college. You have to drop the charges. We are begging you. We will pay for the damages. Just spare him." I looked down at the 2 of them kneeling on the dirty precinct floor. I felt absolutely no pity. I reached down and firmly pried Brittany's shaking fingers off my coat, smoothing the fabric out. "Your son broke into my home," I said. my voice cold, measured, and loud enough for the nearby detectives to hear. He destroyed my personal property and recorded a ransom demand threatening to blackmail me. He made adult choices with full malice and intent. I did not force him to shatter my glass or demand my assets. I stepped around them, adjusting my collar as I looked down at their tear-stained faces. Actions have consequences. I stated my tone devoid of a single ounce of mercy. The felony charges stand. I turned my back on them and walked out of the precinct, leaving their desperate echoing sobs behind me in the sterile lobby. The heavy glass doors shut behind me, sealing their fate as I stepped out into the cool, quiet night. The crisp night air outside the police precinct was the last breath of peace I took before the final pathetic death throes of the Wilson family truly began. I had assumed the absolute freezing of their assets and the felony incarceration of their golden grandson would be the concrete wall that finally stopped them. I had underestimated the resilient, delusional nature of pure entitlement. Instead of accepting their defeat, they scraped the absolute bottom of their ruined barrel. 3 weeks after Braden was locked in a holding cell, a process server approached me outside the lobby of my corporate headquarters. He handed me a thick, heavy manila envelope. It was a formal civil summons. Howard, Cynthia, Jamal, and Brittany had somehow combined their forces for one last, desperate offensive. Through meticulous forensic accounting, Ms. Gallagher later discovered they had pawned Cynthia's last hidden diamond tennis bracelets, sold Howard's remaining luxury watches on the black market, and liquidated Jamal's modest retirement fund just to secure the retainer for Arthur Vance. Vance was a notorious, aggressive civil litigator known throughout the city for taking on high-profile, sensationalized cases that relied heavily on theatrical outrage rather than concrete evidence. Reading the initial filing from the comfort of my home office, I almost admired the sheer audacity of their fiction. They were suing me for $50 million in compensatory and punitive damages. The legal claims were a masterpiece of absolute delusion. They alleged severe elder abuse against my parents, systemic financial manipulation, and corporate fraud. They claimed I had orchestrated a massive illegal conspiracy to strip them of their rightful assets and intentionally drive their teenage grandson to a mental breakdown. The preliminary hearing took place on a rainy Tuesday morning in a heavy oak-paneled courtroom downtown. I arrived with Ms. Gallagher by my side. I wore a sharp, tailored charcoal suit, my posture perfectly straight, my expression an impenetrable vault. The family was already seated at the plaintiff's table. The visual contrast from the country club was staggering. The pristine, untouchable glow of unlimited credit was entirely gone. Howard's suit hung slightly too loose on his frame, his face drawn and exhausted. Cynthia's hair lacked its usual expensive, voluminous blowout, pulled back into a severe, tight style. Brittany and Jamal looked hollowed out, the severe stress of Braden's impending felony trial, wearing heavy bags under their eyes. Yet as I took my seat at the defense table, they shot me glares of venomous, unified triumph. They genuinely believed this courtroom was the arena where they would reclaim their stolen kingdom. The judge, an older, stern-faced man named Harrison, called the court to order. Arthur Vance immediately took the floor and the performance began. Vance was a highly theatrical man. He paced the hardwood floor of the courtroom, using his hands to paint tragic pictures in the air. He did not present financial facts or contractual law. He presented a calculated, emotional opera designed to manipulate the narrative. He pointed a trembling, dramatic finger directly at me, addressing the judge with manufactured, breathless outrage. "Your Honor, before you sits a woman who has weaponized her own bank accounts to commit emotional and financial patricide," Vance declared, his voice echoing loudly off the high ceilings. "We are here today to expose a horrific, targeted campaign of elder abuse and corporate fraud. Howard and Cynthia Wilson are upstanding, benevolent pillars of this community. They have spent 35 years building a legacy of love, unity, and prosperity, and they have been brutally victimized by their own flesh and blood." Vance paced in front of the plaintiff's table, resting a comforting hand on Howard's slumped shoulder. He spun a narrative where I was the deeply unstable, jealous black sheep of the family, consumed by an unnatural, spiteful malice. According to his twisted timeline, I was a vindictive predator who had spent years secretly hoarding wealth for the sole sociopathic purpose of destroying the loving family that had provided for me. He moved on to the specific allegations of financial manipulation. He framed the legal bridge loan Howard had taken out as a predatory, illegal entrapment scheme. He claimed my private shadow network was an illicit syndicate that operated in bad faith, intentionally hiding its ownership to deceive vulnerable senior citizens into signing away their life's work. He argued that forcing the immediate repayment of the loan and freezing their assets at a public gala was a calculated act of severe psychological torture, specifically designed to cause heart failure and mental distress to elderly victims. "This was not a legal foreclosure, Your Honor," Vance shouted, slamming his hand down on the wooden podium. "This was a hostile, fraudulent ambush. This was an unhinged daughter executing a public assassination of her parents' character out of pure, unadulterated spite." He then turned his theatrics toward Brittany and Jamal. He practically wept as he brought up Braden. He completely erased the fact that Braden had broken into my home with a crowbar and recorded a ransom demand. Instead, Vance painted the teenager as a terrified, desperate child, a victim of my collateral damage. He argued that my relentless sociopathic destruction of the family's stability had pushed a straight-A student to the absolute brink of temporary insanity. He blamed me entirely for the boy's felony charges, claiming I had baited the child into my home to trap him. Vance concluded his opening remarks by demanding the immediate unfreezing of all Wilson family assets, a total reversal of the corporate foreclosures, the dropping of all criminal charges against Braden, and massive punitive damages. He demanded that the court stop this vindictive, unstable woman from ruining a successful, loving family. The courtroom fell into a heavy, suffocating silence as Vance returned to his seat, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. Howard and Cynthia sat up a little straighter. Brittany shot me a smug, vindicated smirk across the aisle. They had laid all their cards on the table, betting their very last dime on this desperate, fictional narrative. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting lightly on the defense table, waiting for the judge to turn his attention to Ms. Gallagher. Judge Harrison peered over his reading glasses, the silence in the courtroom stretching until it became almost physically oppressive. He shifted his gaze from the heavily breathing Arthur Vance over to our table. He gave a brief, subtle nod. It was our floor. Ms. Gallagher stood. She did not pace. She did not raise her voice or gesture wildly toward the ceiling. She simply picked up a thick leather-bound folio from our table and walked to the podium with the measured, inevitable stride of a ticking clock. "Your Honor, opposing counsel has spun a highly entertaining piece of fiction this morning," Ms. Gallagher began, her voice slicing through the heavy air with chilling precision. "He speaks of generational wealth, of a family empire, of an untouchable legacy stolen by a vindictive daughter. But the entire foundation of this lawsuit rests on a fundamental, verifiable lie. You cannot steal what does not exist." Gallagher signaled to her paralegal, who promptly carried 3 heavy sealed document boxes to the front, handing one set to the bailiff for the judge and another directly to a suddenly rigid Arthur Vance. "My client did not defraud her parents of their fortune," Ms. Gallagher stated, her gaze locking directly onto Howard. "Because Howard and Cynthia Wilson have not possessed a single ounce of wealth in nearly a decade." A sharp gasp echoed from the gallery. At the plaintiff's table, Howard's face drained of all color, transforming into a sickly, translucent gray. Cynthia gripped the edge of the mahogany table so hard her knuckles turned white. "I direct Your Honor's attention to Exhibit A," Ms. Gallagher continued, entirely unbothered by the shifting energy in the room. "Federal bankruptcy filings dated exactly 7 years ago. Through a series of catastrophic, highly leveraged investments and reckless personal spending, Howard Wilson drove his manufacturing firm and his personal estate into total insolvency. 7 years ago, the Wilsons were facing absolute financial ruin. They were weeks away from having their assets seized by the federal government and being thrown onto the street." Arthur Vance frantically flipped through the documents he had just been handed. His theatrical bravado was evaporating by the second as his eyes scanned the undeniable federal seals and signatures of his own clients. He had not known. Howard and Cynthia had lied to their own representation. Brittany and Jamal spun around in their chairs, staring at their parents in absolute shock. The narrative they had been fed their entire lives was crumbling right in front of them. Ms. Gallagher did not give them a moment to breathe. Exhibit B details the intervention of my client Riley Wilson. Instead of allowing her parents to face the public humiliation of bankruptcy and homelessness, my client utilized her own privately acquired capital to quietly purchase their debt. She bought the toxic loans. She settled the outstanding margins. To protect her father's notoriously fragile ego, my client structured this bailout through a network of shell companies, establishing a fabricated entity that Howard was allowed to call the Wilson Family Trust. The courtroom was dead silent. I sat perfectly still, watching my father shrink into his chair. He could not look at me. He could not look at his other children. The absolute shame of his secret, the reality that he had been living on my charity, while actively trying to destroy me, was finally dragging him under. The generational wealth Mr. Vance spoke of so passionately was in fact a monthly allowance provided by the daughter they are currently attempting to sue. Ms. Gallagher said, her tone laced with professional disgust. The country club memberships, the luxury vehicles, the catered galas, every single dime was funded by Riley Wilson. And Exhibit C brings us to the Lake Forest mansion. Vance dropped the file onto his table, sitting down heavily. He knew it was over. The deed to the Lake Forest estate was legally transferred to Apex Capital Management 7 years ago in exchange for settling Howard Wilson's criminal tax liabilities, Ms. Gallagher stated clearly. My client owns Apex Capital Management. Howard and Cynthia Wilson are not the masters of a family empire. They have been month-to-month tenants living in my client's property, entirely dependent on her goodwill. A goodwill they exhausted when they violated their lease agreements to fund a fraudulent gala and allowed their grandson to break into my client's primary residence. Ms. Gallagher closed her folio. We move for an immediate dismissal of this frivolous, fraudulent lawsuit with prejudice. Furthermore, we ask the court to officially approve our pending motion for the immediate foreclosure and eviction of the tenants currently occupying the Lake Forest property. Judge Harrison spent 3 agonizing minutes reviewing the federal documents in front of him. The only sound in the courtroom was the rustling of heavy paper and the frantic, shallow breathing coming from the plaintiff's table. When the judge finally looked up, his expression was a mask of absolute judicial fury. He bypassed Arthur Vance entirely and glared directly at Howard and Cynthia. In my 30 years on the bench, I have rarely seen such a brazen, repulsive display of perjury and entitlement. Judge Harrison's voice boomed like thunder. You came into my courtroom claiming elder abuse while actively attempting to extort the very person who saved you from the streets. You have lied to this court, you have lied to your counsel, and you have wasted municipal resources on a malicious vendetta. He picked up his wooden gavel. This civil suit is dismissed with prejudice. The plaintiffs are ordered to pay all legal fees incurred by the defense. Judge Harrison turned his gaze to Ms. Gallagher. Counselor, your motion to execute the foreclosure on the Lake Forest estate is officially approved. You have full authorization to remove these individuals from your client's property immediately. The heavy gavel slammed down against the sounding block with a sharp, echoing crack that sealed their fate permanently. Court is adjourned. Cynthia buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking as she broke down into loud, ugly sobs. Howard sat paralyzed, staring at the polished wood of the table as the last shreds of his fabricated legacy turned to dust. I stood up, buttoned my jacket, and walked calmly down the center aisle, leaving them to face the reality of the world without my protection. I did not look back as the heavy oak doors of the courtroom swung shut behind me. That was the end of the legal battle, but the true finale arrived exactly 14 days later. It was a crisp, clear Tuesday morning. I parked my car half a block away from the Lake Forest estate, the engine idling quietly beneath the tinted windows. I sat in the driver's seat and watched the final eviction play out. There were no moving companies with fleets of white-glove professionals. There were no interior designers coordinating a seamless transition. There was only a battered, rust-spotted U-Haul truck parked clumsily on the pristine cobblestone driveway. Howard carried a taped cardboard box down the front steps. He moved slowly, his shoulders permanently hunched, the arrogant posture of a self-made tycoon, entirely replaced by the shuffle of a broken, bankrupt man. Cynthia followed him, dragging a plastic garbage bag filled with clothes. She was not wearing her designer heels or her silk scarves. She wore faded sweatpants, her face pale and drawn as she looked around, nervously terrified that her former country club neighbors might be watching from their windows. Brittany and Jamal emerged from the garage, struggling to lift a heavy mattress. The past 2 weeks had absolutely decimated them. The spectacular failure of their civil suit had completely drained their remaining illicitly pawned funds. Furthermore, the public nature of the courtroom disclosures had reached the financial sector. Jamal was officially blacklisted in the tech world. Once the venture capital firms and corporate boards caught wind of his active participation in a fraudulent lawsuit and his attempt to cover up a felony extortion plot, his career evaporated overnight. Background checks for executive roles immediately flagged his perjury. No reputable firm would even accept his calls. He was reduced to manual labor, hauling a cheap mattress into the back of a rented truck in the middle of a Tuesday. And then there was Braden. He sat on the curb near the mailbox, staring blankly at the asphalt. He was out on bail awaiting his community service sentencing. He wore a bulky GPS tracking ankle monitor over his socks. The arrogant, sneering boy who had smashed my porcelain and threatened to destroy my empire was gone. He was just a terrified teenager facing hundreds of hours picking up litter along the interstate, his Ivy League future entirely erased by his own reckless entitlement. I watched them struggle with the heavy metal ramp of the truck. I felt no pity. I felt no sorrow. I felt nothing but the clean, sterile reality of consequence. I shifted the car into drive. I did not roll down the window to offer a final parting word or a victorious smirk. I simply pulled away from the curb and drove down the tree-lined street, leaving them to the life they had rightfully earned. The drive back to the financial district was smooth and quiet. I handed my keys to the valet, rode the private elevator up to the top floor, and stepped into my penthouse. The shattered glass of the terrace doors had been completely replaced. The slashed Italian leather sofa had been hauled away and substituted with a pristine new piece. The physical damage to my sanctuary was entirely erased. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked out over the city skyline. The sun was beginning to set, casting a brilliant golden glow across the steel and glass of the metropolis. For 35 years I had carried the suffocating weight of my family's expectations, their greed and their relentless manipulation. I had allowed the arbitrary concept of blood to bind me to a toxic, parasitic dynamic. I had believed that endurance was a form of loyalty. I had believed that if I just provided enough, absorbed enough, and managed enough of their failures, I would eventually earn my rightful place at their table. I was wrong. Looking out at the sprawling city, I felt a profound, absolute peace settle into my bones. My chest felt light. The air in my home was finally clean. I had not just reclaimed my wealth or my property. I had reclaimed my reality. I had excised a terminal disease from my life. Society conditions us to believe that family is an unbreakable contract, an eternal obligation that must be honored regardless of the cost to your own sanity. We are taught to forgive the unforgivable simply because the people holding the knife happen to share our DNA. We are told to keep the peace, to turn the other cheek, to accept mistreatment because blood is thicker than water. But blood does not entitle anyone to your peace. Genetics do not grant a free pass for abuse, exploitation, or emotional warfare. You have the absolute right to cut off toxic bloodlines. You have the right to look at the people who raised you, or the siblings who grew up beside you, and decide that their presence in your life is too expensive. Setting a boundary is not an act of cruelty. It is an act of survival. You do not owe your success, your wealth, or your mental health to people who view you as a resource rather than a human being. Let them call you cold. Let them call you vindictive. Let them spin their false narratives to anyone who will listen. Your peace is worth infinitely more than their approval. True family is built on mutual respect, unwavering support, and genuine care. If your biological relatives cannot provide that, you have every right to walk away and build a family of your own choosing. You are the sole architect of your environment, and you hold the power to permanently lock the door against anyone who brings chaos into your sanctuary. Have you ever had to sever ties with a toxic family member to protect your own peace? How did you find the courage to finally draw the line and walk away? Share your experiences and your journey in the comments section below. Your story might be the exact validation someone else needs to finally recognize their own worth and cut the cord. If this narrative of setting boundaries, demanding respect, and taking back your power resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story about reclaiming your life and designing your own future. Thank you for listening, and remember, you are absolutely enough exactly as you are.